Case 1. Dana Schlosser. On the afternoon of November 22, 2004, workers at a daycare center in Plano, Texas, received a disturbing phone call from Dana Schlosser, the mother of one of their students. Dana told the worker that something terrible had happened and hung up. The daycare employee immediately called 911. When police arrived at the Schlosser home, they heard gospel music playing loudly through the door. They found Dana Schlosser sitting calmly on the couch, covered in blood, holding a 9-inch kitchen knife and singing hymns. In a crib nearby lay 11-month-old Margaret Schlosser, known as Maggie. Both of the baby's arms had been severed at the shoulders. Maggie was rushed to the hospital but died shortly after arrival. Dana told police that God had commanded her to cut off her daughter's arms. She believed the world was ending and that she needed to give Maggie to God. The case would expose the deadly consequences of untreated mental illness, combined with religious extremism that rejected psychiatric medicine as demonic. Dana Leitner was born in 1969 and grew up in New York. As a child, she was diagnosed with hydrocephalus, a condition involving fluid buildup in the brain. She underwent 8 surgeries before age 13 to implant shunts that would drain the excess fluid. Despite her medical challenges, Dana graduated from Marist College with a bachelor's degree in psychology. She met her future husband, John Schlosser, while they were both students at Marist. They married and eventually moved to Texas, where John worked as a software designer. Dana and John had 2 daughters together before Maggie was born. The family moved from Fort Worth to Illinois when John lost his job, forcing him to work as a freelance consultant. Financial stress mounted as the family struggled. Their home went into foreclosure. During this difficult period, the Schlossers became deeply involved with the Water of Life Church, a small charismatic church led by Pastor Doyle Davidson, a veterinarian who believed he had been called by God to ministry. The teachings at Water of Life Church were extreme. Pastor Davidson believed he was a prophet sent by God. More concerning, he taught that mental illness was not a medical condition, but demonic possession. He preached that medication was against God's will, and that only prayer and faith could cure mental health problems. This teaching would prove catastrophic for Dana Schlosser. When the Schlossers' home was foreclosed, they saw it as an opportunity to move closer to Water of Life Church. They found an apartment in Plano and began attending services multiple times per week. The church became the center of their lives. Pastor Davidson's teachings became their guide for how to live and how to understand the world. In January 2004, Dana gave birth to Margaret. The day after Maggie was born, Dana attempted suicide. She was hospitalized in a psychiatric ward and diagnosed with bipolar disorder with psychotic features. Doctors recognized that she was experiencing severe postpartum mental illness. She needed medication and ongoing psychiatric care. But John Schlosser and Pastor Davidson believed the doctors were wrong. They believed Dana's problems were spiritual, not medical. They believed prayer, not pills, was the answer. A few months after Maggie's birth, Dana had another psychiatric crisis. While her older daughter watched television, Dana ran out of the house screaming. The 5-year-old chased after her mother but could not catch her. Police found Dana and took her to a hospital where doctors diagnosed postpartum psychosis. She was admitted to a mental health facility, but John insisted on taking her home after a short stay, saying she would be more comfortable there. Despite her objections and doctors' recommendations, Dana was removed from professional care and returned to the apartment. Texas Child Protective Services became involved after Dana's hospitalization. They investigated the family and determined that Dana should not be left alone with her children. CPS required supervision and monitoring. For 2 months, the agency followed the case. Dana appeared to improve. She was taking her medication. Things seemed stable. CPS closed the case, lifting the restrictions that prevented Dina from being alone with her children. But Dina stopped taking her medication. John and Pastor Davidson had convinced her that the medication was harmful, that it was preventing God from healing her. They told her to trust in faith instead. Dina listened. She quit her psychiatric medications. She stopped seeing her doctors. She relied on prayer and church attendance to manage her severe mental illness. In the months before Maggie's death, Dina's thinking became increasingly disturbed. She had delusional beliefs that were religious in nature. She became convinced that her pastor, Doyle Davidson, was destined to marry Maggie when the child grew up. She talked about this belief openly, though it made no logical sense. She also became obsessed with news stories that she interpreted as signs of the apocalypse. She saw a story about a boy mauled by a lion and believed it meant the end times were coming. On November 21, 2004, the day before she killed Maggie, Dina told John that she wanted to give the baby to Pastor Davidson. She said God wanted her to hand over their daughter. John's response was troubling. According to later reports, he spanked Dina with a wooden spoon in front of their children. He did not recognize that his wife was experiencing a psychotic episode. He did not call for emergency psychiatric help. He punished her and assumed the matter was resolved. The next morning, November 22nd, Dina was alone with Maggie while her older daughters were at school and John was at work. Dina turned on gospel music in the apartment. She later said she heard God's voice commanding her to cut off Maggie's arms. She believed she was being given a direct order from God, similar to the biblical story of Abraham being commanded to sacrifice Isaac. She retrieved a 9-inch kitchen knife from the kitchen. She picked up Maggie and severed both of the baby's arms at the shoulders. After mutilating her daughter, Dina began trying to cut off her own arms as well. She managed to make deep cuts into her own limbs before stopping. Then she called the daycare center where her older daughter attended and told a worker what she had done. The worker immediately contacted 911. Emergency dispatchers sent police and ambulances to the Schlosser apartment. When police arrived, they heard the gospel music playing loudly. They knocked and received no immediate answer. When they finally gained entry, they found a scene that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. Dina was sitting on the couch covered in blood, holding the large knife, singing Christian hymns. Maggie was in her crib. The 11-month-old baby had both arms severed. One of her hands was in a fist, the other was open. She was dying from blood loss and shock. Paramedics rushed Maggie to the hospital, but the injuries were catastrophic. The baby died shortly after arrival. There was nothing doctors could do. Dina was taken into custody. At the police station, officers heard her repeatedly chanting, "Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Lord." She showed no understanding of the horror of what she had done. She believed she had obeyed God's command. Dina was charged with capital murder. The case shocked the nation. A mother had cut off her baby's arms while gospel music played, believing it was God's will. The extreme nature of the religious delusion and the brutality of the crime were almost incomprehensible. Prosecutors sought to hold Dina accountable, but it was clear she had been severely mentally ill at the time of the attack. Dina's first trial ended in a mistrial when the jury deadlocked. 10 of the 12 jurors believed she had been insane at the time of the killing. 2 believed she knew what she was doing was wrong. The trial revealed disturbing details about Dina's mental state leading up to the murder. Psychiatrists testified that she had been experiencing severe psychotic delusions with religious themes. She genuinely believed God was speaking to her and commanding her actions. Much attention focused on the role of Water of Life Church and Pastor Doyle Davidson. Davidson testified during the trial. He explained his belief that mental illness was demonic possession and that medication interfered with God's ability to heal. He admitted that he had counseled the Schlossers against psychiatric treatment, encouraging them to rely on faith instead. His teachings had directly influenced John and Dina's decision to reject medical care for Dina's severe mental illness. The prosecution tried to prove that despite her mental illness, Dina had known her actions were wrong. They pointed out that she had waited until she was alone to commit the act, suggesting awareness. But the defense successfully argued that Dina's psychotic break had been so complete that she could not distinguish right from wrong. She had been operating in a delusional reality where God commanded her to mutilate her child. In April 2006, Judge Chris Oldner decided the case without a jury, after both sides agreed to the arrangement following the deadlocked jury. Judge Oldner found Dina Schlosser not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to the North Texas State Hospital, a maximum-security psychiatric facility. She would remain there until doctors determined she was no longer a danger to herself or others. At the hospital, Dina became roommates with Andrea Yates, the woman who had drowned her 5 children in a bathtub. Both women were being treated for severe postpartum mental illness that had led them to kill their children. The fact that these 2 cases occurred in Texas within a few years of each other raised questions about maternal mental health care in the state. John Schlosser filed for divorce in 2007. The marriage that had produced 3 daughters and ended in unthinkable tragedy was legally dissolved. As part of the divorce settlement, Dina was prohibited from ever having contact with John or her surviving daughters again. She would never see her older children after what she had done to their baby sister. In November 2008, after 4 years of treatment, doctors recommended that Dina be released to outpatient care. Judge Oldner held a hearing and determined that she was mentally stable enough to leave the hospital. The decision was controversial. Many people, including prosecutors, believed Dina should remain in secure custody indefinitely. But the legal standard required release if doctors believed she could be safely managed as an outpatient. Dina was released with strict conditions. She had to see a psychiatrist weekly. She had to take her medication. She had to be on physician-approved birth control. She could not have unsupervised contact with children. She moved into community housing and attempted to live a normal life. For a time, things seemed stable. But in April 2010, firefighters in Richardson, Texas, found Dina walking down the street at 2:00 a.m. Her behavior suggested she was experiencing psychiatric symptoms again. Authorities petitioned to have her recommitted. A judge agreed, finding that Dina's mental health had deteriorated and she posed a potential danger. She was returned to secure psychiatric care. As of December 2020, Dina Schlosser was ordered to remain committed to a state hospital. She continues to receive psychiatric treatment. She has not been released again. The failures that led to Maggie's death taught the court system that Dina requires ongoing, secure care, not outpatient management. She will likely remain institutionalized for the rest of her life. The case of Dina Schlosser sparked intense debate about the intersection of religious belief and mental health treatment. Pastor Davidson's teachings that mental illness was demonic possession and that medication was evil had directly contributed to a baby's death. Had Dina remained on her psychiatric medications, had she continued seeing doctors, Maggie would likely be alive today. But the combination of untreated psychosis and religious extremism created a lethal situation. Critics argued that religious leaders who counsel against psychiatric treatment for serious mental illness should be held accountable when tragedy results. Davidson's beliefs, while sincerely held, were dangerous and anti-scientific. His influence over the Schlosser family prevented Dina from receiving the medical care she desperately needed. While Davidson was never charged with any crime, his role in the tragedy was undeniable. The case also highlighted failures by Child Protective Services. CPS had been involved with the family after Dina's psychiatric hospitalizations. They had required supervision, but they closed the case too soon just months before Dina killed Maggie. If CPS had maintained oversight, if they had ensured Dina remained on medication and in psychiatric care, the murder might have been prevented. The agency faced criticism for failing to protect a vulnerable child. John Schlosser's role has also been questioned. He knew his wife was severely mentally ill. He had witnessed her suicide attempt, her psychiatric hospitalizations, her psychotic episodes, yet he chose to follow his pastor's advice to reject psychiatric treatment rather than ensure his wife received proper care. The day before the murder, when Dina said she wanted to give Maggie to the pastor, John's response was to spank her with a wooden spoon rather than recognize she was in crisis. His failures to protect his daughter, while not criminal, were profound. Margaret Schlosser was 11 months old when her mother severed her arms with a kitchen knife. She had been a healthy baby, just beginning to experience life. She would be 20 years old now if Dina had been properly medicated and treated. Instead, she died in agony and terror, mutilated by the mother who should have protected her. Her death was entirely preventable. The image of Dina sitting calmly on a couch covered in blood, holding a knife, singing hymns while gospel music played and her daughter lay dying, has become one of the most disturbing scenes in the history of maternal filicide. It represents the complete failure of multiple systems: medical, religious, social services, and familial, to protect a vulnerable child from a severely mentally ill parent. Dina Schlosser remains in psychiatric care today, more than 20 years after she killed her daughter. She has received treatment for her mental illnesses and reportedly understands what she did. She carries the knowledge that she cut off her baby's arms and killed her. That burden, combined with the loss of her other children and the destruction of her family, is the price she pays beyond her institutionalization. The case stands as a warning about the dangers of rejecting modern medicine in favor of faith-based approaches to serious mental illness. Prayer and faith have their place, but they cannot cure psychosis. They cannot manage bipolar disorder. They cannot prevent the kind of catastrophic breakdown that leads to infanticide. Dina Schlosser needed psychiatrists, medication, and professional care. She got a pastor who believed demons were her problem and prayer was the solution. And her baby paid the ultimate price for that deadly combination of religious extremism and untreated severe mental illness. Case 2, Amber Kraker. In January 2016, an 18-year-old woman named Amber Kraker gave birth alone in Abilene, Texas. She had concealed her pregnancy from everyone around her, going through 9 months without prenatal care or telling anyone what was happening to her body. When labor began, she delivered the baby girl by herself. Within minutes of the birth, the infant was dead. Amber had stabbed her newborn daughter multiple times in the neck and chest with a sharp instrument. When police discovered what had happened, Amber claimed the injuries were accidental, that her hand had slipped while she was trying to cut the umbilical cord. But medical examiners determined the wounds were far too numerous and severe to be accidents. The baby had been deliberately stabbed to death. Amber Kraker was just 18 years old when she murdered her newborn daughter. A case that highlighted the deadly consequences of concealed pregnancy, youth, fear, and the absence of support systems that might have saved a child's life. Very little public information exists about Amber Kraker's background before the crime. She was a teenager living in Abilene, Texas, a mid-sized city west of Fort Worth. At some point in 2015, when she was 17 or 18 years old, Amber became pregnant. Like many young women who conceal pregnancies, she told no one. She hid her changing body with loose clothing. She avoided medical care. She did not confide in friends or family members. She went through the entire pregnancy alone, carrying the secret and the growing baby without any support or guidance. Concealed pregnancy is more common than many people realize, particularly among teenagers and young women. Fear is typically the primary motivator. Young women fear their parents' reactions. They fear judgment from their communities. They fear the consequences of revealing they are pregnant outside of marriage or before they are ready to be mothers. As the pregnancy progresses, the fear often intensifies. What might have been manageable to reveal at 2 months becomes seemingly impossible to admit at 7 months. The lie grows until it becomes a trap the young woman cannot escape. In January 2016, Amber went into labor. She was alone when contractions began. She had made no preparations for the birth, no plans for what would happen after the baby arrived. When the labor progressed, she delivered the baby by herself without medical assistance. The infant girl was born alive. She cried. She breathed. She was a living, viable newborn who needed immediate care. Instead of seeking help or calling 911, Amber took a sharp object and stabbed the baby. She stabbed her in the neck. She stabbed her in the chest. She left a small, sharp force injury on the infant's back. The medical examiner who later examined the baby's body found multiple wounds. These were not superficial cuts or single injuries. The baby had been stabbed repeatedly in areas that would cause fatal damage. The wounds penetrated vital structures. The infant died from the injuries Amber inflicted. After killing the newborn, Amber attempted to conceal what had happened. The details of exactly how the baby was discovered are not fully public, but authorities became aware that Amber had given birth and that the infant was dead. When police investigated, they found the baby's body and saw the stab wounds. Medical examiners performed an autopsy and determined the cause of death was homicidal violence. When confronted by law enforcement, Amber offered an explanation that investigators immediately recognized as false. She claimed that she had been trying to cut the umbilical cord after delivering the baby and that her hand had slipped, causing the injuries. She portrayed the death as a tragic accident that occurred during an unassisted birth. She said she had not intended to harm the baby. Medical examiners and forensic experts thoroughly examined the wounds. Their findings contradicted Amber's story completely. The injuries were not consistent with an accidental slip of the hand. The baby had multiple stab wounds to the neck and chest. These were deliberate strikes with a sharp object, not glancing cuts from a clumsy attempt to sever an umbilical cord. The location, depth, and number of wounds demonstrated intentional violence. The small injury on the baby's back further indicated the infant had been attacked from multiple angles. No aspect of the forensic evidence supported the accidental injury narrative. Amber was arrested and charged with murder. At just 18 years old, she faced the possibility of spending the rest of her life in prison. Texas prosecutors treat neonaticide seriously. While some jurisdictions have shown leniency toward young women who kill newborns immediately after birth, recognizing the psychological crisis and panic involved, Texas has been more likely to pursue serious charges and significant sentences. Amber's case proceeded through the legal system relatively quickly. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The forensic findings proved the baby had been stabbed to death. Amber's explanation had been demonstrated to be false. There was no viable defense based on the facts. The only question was whether Amber's age, circumstances, and mental state at the time of the birth would result in any mitigation of her sentence. In 2016, Amber Craker was convicted of murder. The jury or judge, depending on how the case was resolved, determined she was guilty of intentionally killing her newborn daughter. She was sentenced to life in prison. Under Texas law, she will eventually be eligible for parole, but she must serve a substantial minimum term before that possibility exists. Amber will spend decades in prison for the crime she committed when she was barely an adult herself. Amber was transferred to a Texas women's prison to begin serving her sentence. She remains incarcerated today. She is now in her late 20s, having spent her early adult years behind bars. The baby she killed would be 8 or 9 years old now if she had lived. Instead, That child existed for only minutes before Amber stabbed her to death. The case of Amber Kraker fits a pattern seen in neonaticide cases. Young women conceal pregnancies out of fear and shame. They give birth alone and in secret. Panic and desperation override rational thought in the moments after birth. Rather than seeking help or utilizing safe haven options, they kill the infant. The violence is often committed quickly, within minutes or hours of delivery. The young women then attempt to hide the body or deny what happened. What makes Amber's case particularly tragic is her age. She was just 18 when she killed her daughter. She was barely out of childhood herself. Her brain was still developing. Her capacity for long-term thinking and impulse control was not fully mature. She was in a crisis situation, giving birth alone without any support, and she made the worst possible decision. That decision will cost her most of her adult life. Critics of harsh sentencing in neonaticide cases argue that young women like Amber need treatment and support, not life sentences. They point out that these women are typically not dangerous criminals who pose ongoing threats to society. They are young people who made catastrophic choices in moments of extreme stress and fear. Sentencing them to decades in prison serves little rehabilitative purpose and does not bring back the babies they killed. Supporters of serious sentences argue that killing a newborn is murder regardless of the circumstances. The baby was alive and deserved protection. Fear and panic do not justify taking a life. If harsh sentences are not imposed, it sends a message that neonaticide is somehow less serious than other forms of homicide. They argue that consequences must be severe to deter other young women from making similar choices. Texas, like all states, has a safe haven law. Parents can surrender newborns at designated locations, hospitals, fire stations, police stations, without fear of prosecution. The law exists specifically to prevent neonaticide by giving desperate parents an alternative to violence. Had Amber called 911 after giving birth, paramedics would have come to help. The baby would have been taken to a hospital and placed in the care of Child Protective Services. Amber would not have faced criminal charges for abandoning the infant under safe haven protections. Instead, she chose to stab her daughter to death. The question of whether Amber knew about safe haven laws is unknown. Many young people are not aware these laws exist or do not understand how they work. Even those who know about safe haven laws may not think clearly enough in the moment after birth to remember them or act on them. The panic and desperation that leads to concealed pregnancy in the first place often continues through delivery and into the crucial minutes when life or death decisions are made. Amber's case also raises questions about what support systems failed her. Why did she feel she could not tell anyone she was pregnant? Was her family situation such that revealing a pregnancy felt impossible? Did she lack access to resources like pregnancy counseling or adoption services? Were there adults in her life she could have trusted? Or was she so isolated and afraid that she truly believed hiding the pregnancy and eliminating the evidence her baby was her only option? The baby Amber killed never received a name, at least not publicly. She is identified in legal documents simply as Amber Kraker's newborn daughter. She lived for minutes after birth before being stabbed to death. She never knew comfort or safety. She never knew her mother's love. She existed only to die, killed by the person who brought her into the world. Amber Kraker will likely be middle-aged before she has any chance of release. She will serve the sentence for a crime committed when she was a teenager. She will carry the knowledge of what she did for the rest of her life. Whether she feels genuine remorse, whether she has come to understand the gravity of killing her newborn, whether she has received mental health treatment in prison, these are unknown. What is certain is that she took a life in its first moments, and she will pay for that with decades of her own life behind bars. The case serves as a reminder that concealed pregnancies and neonaticide remain ongoing problems despite the existence of safe haven laws and access to birth control and abortion services. Young women continue to hide pregnancies and give birth in secret. Some abandon their babies safely. Others kill them. The factors that lead to these different outcomes are complex and not fully understood. But each case represents a failure of education, a failure of support systems, a failure of families to create environments where young people feel they can ask for help, and ultimately, a failure that costs an innocent newborn their life. Amber Kraker's newborn daughter deserved better than to be stabbed to death minutes after birth. She deserved to be held, to be cared for, to be given a chance at life. She deserved a mother who would protect her, or, if unable to care for her, would ensure she was placed safely with those who could. Instead, she got knife wounds to her neck and chest, and a death so early that she never knew anything but violence and pain. That is the tragedy of Amber Kraker's case, not just that an 18-year-old will spend her life in prison, but that a baby's life ended before it really began, killed by a desperate teenager who saw death as the solution to an impossible situation. Case 3. Deanna Laney. On the night of May 9, 2003, Deanna Laney walked into her front yard in the small town of New Chapel Hill near Tyler, Texas. She called her 3 young sons outside. 8-year-old Joshua, 6-year-old Luke, and 14-month-old Aaron came out to see what their mother wanted. Deanna picked up large rocks from the yard and began bashing her sons' skulls. She struck Joshua repeatedly with the stones until his head was crushed. She did the same to Luke, killing him with brutal blows to the skull. She then attacked baby Aaron, striking him in the head with rocks and leaving him with catastrophic brain damage. When police arrived, Deanna was calm. She told them God had commanded her to kill her children as a test of faith, like the biblical story of Abraham being told to sacrifice Isaac. She believed the world was ending and that God wanted her sons dead. The case would force courts and communities to grapple with where religious faith ends and psychotic delusion begins, and whether a mother who genuinely believes God ordered her to kill should be held criminally responsible. Deanna Laney lived in rural East Texas with her husband Keith and their 3 sons. The family was deeply religious. They attended church regularly and centered their lives around their Christian faith. To those who knew them, the Laneys appeared to be a normal, devout family. Deanna was a stay-at-home mother who homeschooled her children and took care of the household. Keith worked to support the family. They lived quietly in their small community, raising their boys and practicing their faith. In the months leading up to the murders, Deanna's religious beliefs began to intensify in ways that suggested something was deeply wrong. She became increasingly obsessed with end-times prophecy and apocalyptic thinking. She spent hours reading the Bible and interpreting passages about the end of the world. She began to believe that she was receiving direct communication from God. She told people that God was speaking to her, giving her messages and instructions. Friends and family members noticed changes in Deanna's behavior and thinking. She talked about religious topics more frequently and with greater intensity. Her interpretations of Scripture became more extreme. She expressed beliefs that seemed disconnected from mainstream Christian theology. But in religious communities, distinguishing between deep faith and mental illness can be difficult. Deanna's increasing religiosity was concerning, but it was not immediately clear to those around her that she was experiencing psychotic delusions. On the evening of May 9, 2003, Deanna's delusions reached a catastrophic climax. She became convinced that God was commanding her to kill her children. She believed this was a test of her faith, similar to the story in Genesis where God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. In that biblical story, Abraham prepares to obey, but God stops him at the last moment, providing a ram for sacrifice instead. Deanna believed God would do the same for her, that He was testing her obedience and would intervene before her children actually died. Around 10 p.m., Deanna called her sons outside. Joshua and Luke came out to the front yard. Deanna picked up large rocks, stones substantial enough to cause severe damage. She told her sons to lie down. Then she began striking them with the rocks. She bashed Joshua's head repeatedly, crushing his skull with the heavy stones. She did the same to Luke. The blows were brutal and devastating. Both boys suffered massive head trauma. They died in the front yard of their home, killed by their mother wielding rocks. After killing Joshua and Luke, Deanna went back inside and got baby Aaron. She carried the 14-month-old outside and attacked him as well, striking his head with rocks. Aaron survived, but suffered severe brain damage. His injuries would leave him permanently disabled. After the attacks, Deanna called 911. She told the dispatcher what she had done. She said God had told her to kill her children. She was calm as she reported the murders. When police arrived at the scene, they found Joshua and Luke dead in the yard. Aaron was critically injured. Deanna was standing nearby, showing no signs of panic or distress. She explained to officers that she had been obeying God's command. Keith Laney had been inside the house while the murders occurred. He had not witnessed the attacks. When he learned what Deanna had done, he was devastated and in shock. His wife had killed 2 of their sons and severely injured the third. She had done it while he was in the house, just feet away. The horror of the situation was incomprehensible. Deanna was arrested and charged with capital murder. Texas law allowed for the death penalty in such cases. Prosecutors had to decide whether to seek the harshest punishment available. As they investigated, they learned about Deanna's deteriorating mental state in the months before the murders. They spoke with mental health experts who explained that Deanna appeared to have been experiencing a severe psychotic episode with religious delusions. The question facing prosecutors, and eventually a jury, was whether Deanna met the legal standard for insanity. Under Texas law, a defendant could be found not guilty by reason of insanity if they were unable to know their conduct was wrong due to a severe mental disease or defect. Deanna clearly knew she was killing her children, but did she understand it was wrong? Or did she genuinely believe God was commanding her actions and that she was being tested like Abraham? The trial drew comparisons to the Andrea Yates case, which had occurred in Texas just 2 years earlier. Yates had drowned her 5 children while experiencing severe postpartum psychosis. She had been convicted initially, but was later found not guilty by reason of insanity on retrial. The parallels between the cases were striking. Both involved Texas mothers with severe mental illness killing their children based on religious delusions about saving them or obeying God. Mental health experts who evaluated Deanna testified that she had been experiencing psychotic delusions at the time of the murders. She had believed God was speaking directly to her. She had interpreted her thoughts and experiences through a lens of religious mania. She had convinced herself that killing her children was not only acceptable, but required by God. Psychiatrists explained that Deanna's delusions were so powerful that she genuinely could not recognize her actions as wrong in the moment she committed them. The defense presented Deanna's case as a tragedy of untreated mental illness manifesting through religious delusion. They argued she was not a criminal but a sick woman who needed psychiatric treatment. They emphasized that she had no history of violence, that she had been a devoted mother before her mental breakdown, and that she had acted based on beliefs generated by psychosis, not by evil intent. The prosecution faced a difficult decision. The facts of the case were horrific. 2 young boys had been bludgeoned to death with rocks by their mother. A third child was permanently brain damaged. The community wanted justice, but Deanna's mental illness was documented and severe. Pursuing the death penalty against someone who was clearly psychotic raised ethical and legal questions. The jury heard weeks of testimony. They saw crime scene photographs showing Joshua and Luke's bodies. They heard from Aaron's doctors about his injuries and prognosis. They listened to psychiatric experts explain psychosis, delusion, and the intersection of mental illness with religious belief. They had to decide whether Deanna had known killing her children was wrong, despite believing God commanded it. In April 2004, the jury reached a verdict. They found Deanna Laney not guilty by reason of insanity on charges of capital murder. The verdict meant Deanna would not go to prison. Instead, she would be committed to a state mental hospital for treatment. She would remain there until mental health professionals determined she was no longer a danger to herself or others. The verdict was controversial. Some in the community felt justice had not been served. Others believed the verdict recognized the reality of severe mental illness and its impact on criminal responsibility. Deanna was committed to a psychiatric facility where she received treatment for her mental illness. She was diagnosed with psychotic disorder and likely suffered from schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. With medication and therapy, her delusions resolved. She came to understand that God had not commanded her to kill her children. She realized she had been experiencing psychotic symptoms that distorted her perception of reality. The grief and guilt she felt once her mind cleared were immense. Years after the murders, Deanna's doctors determined she had been successfully treated and no longer posed a danger. She was released from the psychiatric hospital into outpatient care with strict monitoring conditions. She had to continue taking medication, attend regular psychiatric appointments, and comply with supervision requirements. Her release was controversial. Many felt that someone who had killed 2 children should never be freed, regardless of mental illness. Others argued that indefinite commitment after successful treatment would be unjust. Keith Laney divorced Deanna following the murders. He was left to raise Aaron, who required extensive medical care and therapy due to his brain injuries. Keith had lost 2 sons and watched his 3rd son struggle with permanent disabilities. His marriage ended. His family was destroyed. He had to find a way to move forward while carrying unimaginable grief. Aaron survived, but the rocks had damaged his brain severely. He required ongoing medical care and would never fully recover. The toddler, who should have grown up healthy and whole, instead faced a lifetime of challenges due to the injuries his mother inflicted. He lost his brothers and the mother who had attacked him all in one night. Joshua and Luke Laney were 8 and 6 years old when their mother killed them. They were young boys who trusted their mother completely. When she called them outside, they came willingly. They had no reason to fear her. They died brutal deaths, beaten with rocks, killed by the woman who should have protected them above all others. The Laney case highlighted the dangers of untreated mental illness in religious contexts. Deanna's increasing delusions had been expressed through religious language and themes. Her family and community, steeped in faith themselves, may have struggled to distinguish between religious fervor and psychotic symptoms. When Deanna said God was speaking to her, did people hear the voice of faith or the voice of madness? The answer was both, and the inability to recognize the latter cost 2 children their lives. Mental health experts emphasize that the vast majority of religious people, even deeply devout believers, do not experience psychotic delusions. Faith and mental illness are separate phenomena, though they can intersect when someone with psychosis interprets their symptoms through a religious framework. Deanna's delusions took the form of religious commands because religion was central to her worldview. Had she been deeply committed to different beliefs, her psychosis might have manifested differently. But the content of the delusions, whether religious, political, or otherwise, is less important than recognizing them as symptoms of serious mental illness, requiring immediate intervention. The use of rocks as weapons made the Laney case particularly brutal. Deanna did not use a gun that killed quickly or poison that worked invisibly. She picked up heavy stones and bashed her children's heads with them. The violence was direct, physical, and prolonged. She had to strike the boys multiple times to kill them. This method of murder seems especially cruel, though Deanna, in her delusional state, believed she was acting in obedience to divine command. The disconnect between her perception and reality was complete. The case also raised questions about when religious communities should intervene in cases of potential mental illness. Deanna had told people God was speaking to her. She had expressed increasingly extreme religious beliefs. At what point does someone's faith become concerning enough to suggest psychiatric evaluation? Religious communities value faith and spiritual experiences. Many believers describe feeling God's presence or receiving guidance through prayer. Distinguishing between normal religious experience and psychotic delusion requires careful attention and willingness to consider that mental illness might be at play. Deanna Laney lives today as an outpatient under psychiatric care. She is medicated and monitored. She understands that she killed 2 of her children and injured the 3rd while experiencing a severe mental illness. She carries that knowledge with her every day. Joshua and Luke remain dead. Aaron lives with permanent disabilities. Keith has rebuilt his life without the wife who destroyed their family. And a small community in East Texas remembers the night when a mother killed her sons with rocks, believing God commanded it, in a tragedy that could have been prevented if her psychosis had been recognized and treated before violence erupted. Case 4. Mary Beth Tinning. On January 3, 1972, Mary Beth Tinning's first child died at just 9 days old. On December 20, 1985, her 9th child died at 4 months old. In the 14 years between those 2 deaths, 7 other children in the Tinning household died under circumstances that were labeled tragic, unexplainable, and heartbreaking. The community of Schenectady rallied around the family repeatedly, offering sympathy and support to a mother who seemed cursed by unimaginable loss. No one suspected the truth until it was far too late. Mary Beth Tinning was killing her children, one by one, to gain the attention and sympathy she craved. Mary Beth Rowe grew up in Duanesburg, New York, in a household where she felt unwanted. Her father fought in World War II and was absent for much of her early childhood. Her mother worked, and Mary Beth was passed between relatives who made clear they saw her as a burden. One relative told her directly that she was an accident, that no one had wanted her. She grew up feeling worthless and invisible. Those feelings would shape the rest of her life in ways no one could have predicted. Mary Beth met Joe Tinning on a blind date in the mid-1960s. He was a shy, kind man who worked for General Electric. He treated Mary Beth with gentleness and respect. They married in 1965 and settled in Schenectady. For a while, life seemed stable. Mary Beth had found someone who cared about her. But when her father died in 1971, just a year after the birth of her second child, something inside Mary Beth broke. Her father had never told her he loved her. Now he never would. She spiraled into depression. In January 1972, Mary Beth gave birth to her 3rd child, Jennifer. The baby girl died 9 days later in the hospital from what doctors diagnosed as meningitis. The death was ruled natural. The community expressed sympathy for the young couple who had lost their infant daughter. Mary Beth received attention, condolences, and support. People noticed her. They cared about her suffering. For someone who had spent her life feeling invisible, the attention was powerful. 6 weeks later, in March 1972, 2-year-old Joseph died. Mary Beth said she found him having a seizure. He was rushed to the hospital, but could not be saved. Doctors could not determine a clear cause of death. They speculated about a genetic condition or an undiagnosed illness. The community was shocked. The Tinning family had now lost 2 children in 2 months. Friends organized meals and visits. People reached out to offer comfort. Mary Beth was the center of a circle of care and concern. In 1973, Mary Beth and Joe had another daughter, Barbara. The little girl seemed healthy at first, but in January 1974, Mary Beth called an ambulance saying Barbara had stopped breathing. The child died on the way to the hospital. She was 4.5 years old. Once again, no clear cause of death could be determined. Medical professionals began to wonder if there was some genetic condition affecting the Tinning children, some inherited disorder that caused sudden death. No one suggested the deaths might not be natural. In November 1975, Mary Beth gave birth to Timothy. He lived only 2 weeks. In January 1976, Mary Beth said she woke to find him dead in his crib. Sudden infant death syndrome was listed as the cause. The Tinning family had now lost 4 children. The community's sympathy was mixed with confusion and concern. How could one family experience so much tragedy, but no one suspected foul play? People assumed the Tinnings were simply extraordinarily unlucky. Nathan was born in March 1976, just 2 months after Timothy's death. He lived longer than some of his siblings, surviving to nearly 3 years old. In September 1978, Mary Beth called for help, saying Nathan had stopped breathing. He was pronounced dead. Again, the cause was unclear. Doctors noted the pattern of deaths, but could not identify a medical explanation. The Tinnings adopted a son, Michael, in 1978. Perhaps they hoped that a child not biologically related to them would be spared whatever curse or genetic condition seemed to be killing their biological children. Michael was healthy when they brought him home. In March 1981, Mary Beth called emergency services saying he had stopped breathing. He died at age 2.5. The autopsy found no definitive cause. In 1985, Mary Beth gave birth to Mary Frances. The baby died at just over a month old. Mary Beth said she found her unresponsive in the crib. SIDS was again suspected. The Tinning family had now lost 7 children. The 8th, Jonathan, was born later in 1985 and died within weeks. His death certificate cited sudden infant death. By this point, there were whispers in Schenectady. How could 8 children in one family die? Some people began to quietly question whether something else might be happening. But those questions were not voiced loudly enough or to the right people. The medical community had seen each death individually rather than as part of a pattern. Different doctors, different hospitals, different circumstances. No one had put all the pieces together. In August 1985, Mary Beth gave birth to her 9th child, Tammy Lynn. Dr. Bradley Ford, the baby's pediatrician, was aware of the family's tragic history. He recommended that the Tinnings install a specialized monitoring device that would track Tammy Lynn's breathing and heart rate. Given how many children had died in their care, such precautions seemed not only reasonable, but necessary. Mary Beth dismissed the suggestion. She said she did not need a monitor. She would watch the baby herself. On December 20th, 1985, Mary Beth called an ambulance. She said Tammy Lynn, now 4 months old, had stopped breathing. Paramedics arrived to find the infant already dead. This time, the response was different. Police and social services were notified immediately. The sheer number of deaths in the Tinning household had finally triggered an investigation. Tammy Lynn's body was sent for thorough forensic examination. Dr. Michael Baden, a renowned forensic pathologist, examined Tammy Lynn's remains. He determined that the infant had been smothered. There were signs of asphyxiation. The death was not natural. It was homicide. With this finding, authorities looked back at the other 8 deaths with new eyes. The pattern was suddenly obvious. 9 children had died in one household over 14 years. The mother had been present for each death. No genetic condition, no hereditary disease, no curse of bad luck. Mary Beth Tinning had been killing her children. Police brought Mary Beth and Joe in for questioning on December 20th. They were interviewed separately. Investigators confronted Mary Beth with their suspicions. For hours, she denied everything. She insisted her children had died of natural causes. She said she was a victim of tragedy, not a murderer. But the evidence was mounting, and the questioning continued. Finally, Mary Beth broke. She confessed to killing 3 of her children. Mary Beth admitted to smothering Timothy, Nathan, and Tammy Lynn with pillows. She described how she had held the pillow over their faces until they stopped breathing. She said she did it because she was not a good mother, because the children would not stop crying, because she could not handle the stress. But she insisted she had not harmed the other 6 children. Those deaths, she claimed, were natural. Investigators did not believe her. The pattern was too clear. But they could only charge her with what she had confessed to and what they could prove. Joe Tinning was devastated. In his interview with police, he admitted that he had sometimes suspected something was wrong. After so many deaths, how could he not wonder? But he had pushed those thoughts aside. He had trusted his wife. He had believed in her. Now he had to confront the possibility that the woman he loved had been systematically murdering their children for 14 years. Mary Beth was arrested and charged with the murder of Tammy Lynn. Prosecutors considered charging her with the deaths of Timothy and Nathan as well, since she had confessed to killing them. But they decided to focus on the most recent case, where forensic evidence was strongest. She pleaded not guilty despite her confession. The trial began in June 1987. Prosecutors presented the forensic evidence showing Tammy Lynn had been smothered. They called Dr. Baden, who explained how he had determined the cause of death. They presented the confession Mary Beth had given to police. They also called experts who discussed Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition where caregivers harm those in their care to gain attention and sympathy. The pattern of Mary Beth's behavior fit the diagnosis perfectly. Each time a child died, she received an outpouring of community support. She was noticed, cared for, and attended to. The attention fed a deep need inside her. The defense argued that Mary Beth's confession had been coerced, that she had been under enormous stress and had said things she did not mean. They pointed out that there was no physical evidence proving she had harmed the other children. They tried to create doubt about whether Tammy Lynn had been murdered at all, suggesting the diagnosis of smothering was uncertain. They portrayed Mary Beth as a grieving mother who had suffered unimaginable loss and was now being wrongly accused. The jury did not accept the defense's arguments. On July 17, 1987, they convicted Mary Beth Tinning of second-degree murder. They found she had caused Tammy Lynn's death through depraved indifference to human life rather than deliberate, premeditated murder. It was a lesser charge than first-degree murder, but it still carried a severe penalty. Judge Clifford Harrigan sentenced Mary Beth to 20 years to life in prison. She was taken to Bedford Hills Correctional Facility to begin serving her sentence. Over the years, Mary Beth appeared before the parole board multiple times. Each time, she was denied. The board noted her lack of genuine remorse, her continued insistence that she had not harmed most of her children, and the horrific nature of her crimes. She had killed not one, but multiple children over an extended period. She had watched the community mourn with her, had accepted their sympathy, all while knowing she was responsible. The calculated nature of her actions made her a poor candidate for release. In her parole hearings, Mary Beth offered statements that revealed the depth of her psychological damage. In one hearing, she said that after the deaths of her other children, she believed Tammy Lynn would die too, so she killed the baby herself. The logic was twisted and incomprehensible. In another hearing, she admitted she could not remember why she had done it, only that she knew she had. She described herself as a damaged, worthless piece of person. Her statement suggested she had never truly understood the magnitude of what she had done. In 2018, After serving 31 years, Mary Beth Tinning was granted parole on her 7th attempt. She was 75 years old. The decision was controversial. Victims' advocates argued that someone who had killed multiple children should never be released. Prosecutors noted that Mary Beth had never fully accepted responsibility for all the deaths. But the parole board determined she had served sufficient time and no longer posed a threat. She was released with strict conditions. She returned to Schenectady County, where she lives with her husband Joe, who remarkably remained married to her through everything. The Tinning case exposed catastrophic failures in the medical and social service systems. 9 children died over 14 years, and no one connected the dots until the 9th death. Doctors attributed the deaths to SIDS, genetic conditions, and natural causes without considering the common factor. Mary Beth was present for every single death. The medical community of the 1970s and 1980s was not equipped to recognize patterns of serial child murder within families. SIDS was poorly understood, and the idea that a mother would systematically kill her children was almost unthinkable. The case led to greater awareness of Munchausen syndrome by proxy and similar conditions. Medical professionals began to recognize that multiple unexplained deaths in one family should trigger immediate investigation rather than sympathy. Protocols were developed for handling such cases. The Tinning case became a teaching example of what warning signs look like and how systems must respond. Dr. Michael Baden, who performed the autopsy on Tammy Lynn, later wrote about the case in his book on forensic pathology. He expressed frustration that earlier intervention could have saved lives. If the medical community had looked at the pattern of deaths sooner, children would not have died. The failure was not malicious, but rather a failure of imagination. People could not believe a mother would do such things. The question of why Mary Beth killed her children has never been fully answered. The diagnosis of Munchausen syndrome by proxy provides a framework, but not a complete explanation. Mary Beth craved attention and sympathy. Each child's death brought her into the center of community concern. She was noticed, comforted, and cared for. For someone who had grown up feeling worthless and invisible, that attention was intoxicating. But why not seek attention through other means? Why was murder her method of choice? Those questions remain partially unanswered. Joe Tinning's role in the case has also been debated. How could he not have known? After the 3rd death, the 4th, the 8th, how could he continue to believe these were natural tragedies? Some have argued he was willfully blind, that he did not want to see what was happening because the truth was too terrible to confront. Others suggest he genuinely trusted his wife and could not imagine her capable of such acts. He has never been charged with any crime, but the moral questions linger. 9 children are dead because Mary Beth Tinning smothered them. Jennifer, Joseph, Barbara, Timothy, Nathan, Mary Frances, Jonathan, Michael, and Tammy Lynn never had the chance to grow up. They were killed in infancy or early childhood by the person who should have protected them above all others. Their deaths were not accidents or tragedies or acts of a merciful God. They were murders committed slowly over 14 years by a woman who needed attention more than she needed her children alive. Mary Beth Tinning walks free today, an elderly woman living quietly in the community where she committed her crimes. The graves of her 9 children remain as permanent markers of what she did. The case stands as a reminder that evil does not always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it hides behind a mother's grief, behind community sympathy, behind the unthinkable. Assumption that no mother would harm her own child. The Tinning case taught us that assumption is dangerously wrong. Mothers can kill. Systems must be vigilant. And 9 dead children are 9 too many. Case 5. Mitchell Blair. On March 24, 2015, court-ordered eviction workers arrived at a Detroit apartment in the Martin Luther King Apartments complex. Mitchell Blair had not paid rent in months, and the 36th District Court had authorized her removal. When the crew entered the apartment, they began moving furniture and belongings. Then they tried to move a large white deep freezer from the living room. When they opened it to see if it was empty, they found something that would send shockwaves through the city. Inside were the frozen bodies of 2 children, wrapped in plastic and stored like discarded objects. The children had been there for years while their mother continued living in the apartment, walking past the freezer every single day. Mitchell Blair was born in 1980 and grew up in Detroit. She had a difficult childhood marked by instability and abuse. She later claimed she had been mistreated by family members and had little education or support. By the time she reached adulthood, she had 4 children with different fathers, none of whom played significant roles in the children's lives. Blair was unemployed and struggled financially. She lived in subsidized housing and depended on public assistance. Friends and neighbors rarely saw her children, though they occasionally heard yelling and commotion from the apartment. Blair had 4 children, 2 daughters and 2 sons. The oldest daughter, Gabrielle, was 17 in 2015. The youngest son was 8. In between were Stephen Barry and Stoney Blair, the 2 children whose bodies would be found in the freezer. To the limited number of people who knew the family, the children seemed to come and go. Blair told various stories about where Stephen and Stoney were. She said they were staying with relatives or had gone to live with their fathers. No one pushed for details. No one insisted on seeing the children. The explanations were accepted at face value. In August 2012, Blair began torturing 9-year-old Stephen. She later claimed that her surviving son, then just a young child, had told her Stephen had sexually abused him. Blair said she questioned Stephen, and he admitted to the abuse. There was never any evidence that such abuse occurred. Prosecutors would later find no indication that Stephen had harmed anyone. But Blair used the accusation as justification for what came next. Blair subjected Stephen to horrific torture. She poured scalding hot water on his genitals, causing severe burns. She beat him with sticks and cords. She put plastic bags over his head to suffocate him. The abuse went on for days. Stephen was a small 9-year-old boy being tortured by his adult mother in an apartment where no one intervened. Gabrielle, the teenage daughter, later told investigators she had witnessed some of the abuse, but had been too terrified of her mother to do anything. She described a household ruled by fear and violence. Stephen died in August 2012 from the sustained torture. His small body gave out under the brutality inflicted by his mother. Blair wrapped his body in plastic bags and stuffed it into the deep freezer in the living room. She then cleaned up any evidence of what had happened and continued living in the apartment. The freezer sat in the living room, a piece of furniture anyone entering the apartment would see. Inside was Stephen's frozen corpse. 9 months later, in May 2013, Blair turned her rage on her 13-year-old daughter, Stoney. Blair claimed that Stoney had also sexually abused her younger brother. Again, there was no evidence this had occurred. Prosecutors found nothing to support Blair's accusations, but Blair believed it, or claimed to believe it, and she decided Stoney would suffer the same fate as Stephen. Blair tortured Stoney with the same methods she had used on Stephen. She scalded her with hot water. She beat her with sticks and objects. She put bags over her head. She brutalized the 13-year-old girl over a period of time, inflicting pain and terror. Gabrielle witnessed some of this abuse as well. The teenage girl watched helplessly as her mother murdered her siblings. She was afraid that if she tried to stop it or tell anyone, she would be next. Stoney died from the torture in May 2013. Blair wrapped her daughter's body in plastic, opened the freezer in the living room, and placed Stoney's body inside next to Stephen's. She now had 2 of her children stored in the freezer. She closed the lid and went about her life. The freezer remained in the living room for nearly 2 more years. Blair continued living in the apartment with her 2 surviving children. Gabrielle, and her youngest son. The children had to walk past the freezer every day, knowing their siblings were inside. Gabrielle later described the psychological horror of living in that apartment. She was afraid to go near the freezer. She had nightmares about what was inside, but she could not escape. She was trapped in the apartment with a mother who had already killed 2 of her children and might kill again. The surviving children showed signs of severe abuse. Gabrielle had marks from being whipped with cords. The youngest son had injuries from being beaten. Blair ruled the household through violence and intimidation. The children went to school occasionally, but their attendance was sporadic. When they did attend, they were withdrawn and afraid. Teachers noticed some problems, but did not report suspicions of severe abuse. The children slipped through the cracks of a system that should have protected them. Neighbors in the apartment complex rarely saw the Blair children. Some residents later said they had heard screaming and loud noises from the apartment, but had not called authorities. They assumed it was just a mother disciplining her children. Others said they had seen Blair, but almost never saw all 4 children together. No one connected these observations to something sinister. No one imagined that 2 children were dead inside the apartment. In 2015, Blair stopped paying rent. She had no income and no way to cover her housing costs. The property management company began eviction proceedings. Blair did not contest the eviction or try to prevent it. She simply stopped responding. When the court authorized the eviction, workers were dispatched to remove her belongings and clear the apartment. On March 24th, the eviction crew arrived. Blair was not home. Workers entered the apartment and began removing items. They came to the large white freezer in the living room. One worker opened it to see if there was food inside that needed to be discarded. Instead, he saw plastic-wrapped shapes that looked like human bodies. He immediately called for law enforcement. Police arrived and confirmed the horrific discovery. Inside the freezer were the bodies of 2 children. They were frozen solid, preserved in the state they had been in when placed there. Stephen had been in the freezer for nearly 3 years. Stoney had been there for almost 2 years. Investigators took photographs, documented the scene, and began the process of removing the bodies. The apartment was declared a crime scene. Officers searched for evidence of what had happened. Detectives located Mitchell Blair and brought her in for questioning. She was informed that the bodies of 2 children had been found in her freezer. Blair showed no emotion. She did not cry or express shock. She calmly admitted that the children were hers. She told investigators she had killed Stephen and Stoney because they had sexually abused her youngest son. She described the torture she had inflicted on them. She said she had no regrets. Blair was arrested and charged with 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of premeditated murder, and 1 count of torture. The charges carried mandatory sentences of life without parole. Prosecutors made clear they would seek the maximum penalties. Blair was held without bond pending trial. Mental health experts examined Blair to determine if she was competent to stand trial. They found her competent. She understood the charges against her and could participate in her defense. She was not psychotic or delusional. She knew what she had done and knew it was wrong. She simply did not care. In June 2015, Blair appeared in court and pleaded guilty. She admitted to killing Stephen and Stoney. She admitted to torturing them. She said she would accept the death penalty if Michigan had one. The state had abolished capital punishment decades earlier, so the harshest available sentence was life without parole. Blair said she would take it. She showed no remorse. During the plea hearing, prosecutors presented details of the abuse Blair had inflicted on her children. The descriptions were graphic and disturbing. Blair had subjected Stephen and Stoney to prolonged torture before they died. She had caused them immense pain and suffering. She had then stored their bodies in her living room for years, walking past them daily without apparent concern. The judge and everyone in the courtroom listened in horror. Blair's sentencing hearing took place on July 17, 2015. Before the sentence was imposed, Blair was allowed to speak. Instead of expressing remorse, she used the time to attack the fathers of her children. She blamed them for being absent, for not helping her, for leaving her alone to raise the children. She said she was telling the truth about everything and did not care what people thought of her. She referred to Stephen and Stoney as demons. She said she felt no remorse for their deaths. Wayne County Circuit Judge Dana Hathaway responded to Blair's statements with barely contained anger. She told Blair that she had imposed the death penalty on her own children. She described the apartment as a house of horrors where children lived in fear and suffering. She said Blair's primary responsibility as a mother had been to protect her children, and instead she had tortured and killed them. Judge Hathaway sentenced Blair to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Blair would never be released. She would die in prison. Blair was transferred to the Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Ypsilanti, Michigan, where she remains today. She has not expressed remorse for what she did. In prison interviews, she has continued to insist that Stephen and Stoney were demons who deserved what happened to them. She maintains that they abused her youngest son, though no evidence supports this claim. Her complete lack of empathy or regret has made her a figure of particular notoriety among convicted child killers. The two surviving children, Gabrielle and her younger brother, were removed from Blair's custody immediately after the discovery. They were placed with relatives who could provide a stable, safe home. Both children required extensive therapy to deal with the trauma of what they had witnessed and experienced. Gabrielle, in particular, struggled with guilt over not having been able to save her siblings. Therapists worked with both children to help them understand that they were victims, not responsible for what their mother had done. The youngest son, who Blair claimed had been abused by his siblings, told social workers and therapists that he had never been abused by Stephen or Stoney. He said his mother had told him to say those things. He described being beaten and abused by Blair himself. The accusations against Stephen and Stoney appeared to have been fabrications Blair used to justify her violence. She had invented a narrative that allowed her to see herself as protecting one child rather than acknowledging she was a murderer. The case raised disturbing questions about how two children could be killed and stored in an apartment for years without anyone noticing or intervening. Neighbors had heard disturbances. Teachers had seen warning signs. The children had visible injuries. Yet no one made a report that led to investigation. The system that should have protected Stephen and Stoney failed them completely. Detroit police and social services faced criticism for not identifying the abuse sooner. Child Protective Services had not been involved with the family despite clear indicators of problems. Schools had not followed up when the children stopped attending regularly. Neighbors had not called authorities when they heard screaming. Each small failure contributed to a larger catastrophe. The apartment building where the murders occurred became infamous. The specific unit was eventually renovated, but residents of the building struggled with the knowledge of what had happened there. Some moved out, unable to live in a place where such horror had occurred. The building management faced questions about whether they should have noticed something was wrong. The entire community grappled with how two children could have been murdered, and no one knew. Stephen Barry would be 21 years old today if his mother had not tortured and killed him when he was 9. Stoney Blair would be 23 if she had not been murdered at 13. They had their whole lives ahead of them. Instead, they endured days of torture at the hands of their mother before dying and being stuffed into a freezer like garbage. Their bodies were stored in that freezer for years, treated with less dignity than people give to spoiled food. The image of that white freezer in the living room containing the bodies of two children while their mother lived her daily life around it has become one of the most haunting aspects of the case. It speaks to a level of detachment and inhumanity that is difficult to comprehend, Mitchell Blair was not acting in a moment of rage or psychotic break. She killed her children over a period of time, stored their bodies, and continued living with the evidence of her crimes for years. That calculated, prolonged nature of her actions sets her apart, even among those who have killed their children. Mitchell Blair will spend the rest of her life in prison. She will never again have the opportunity to harm a child. She will never walk free. Stephen and Stoney will never come back. Their siblings will carry the trauma of what they witnessed for the rest of their lives. A community learned that evil can hide in plain sight, in an ordinary apartment, behind the closed door of a family no one paid enough attention to. The House of Horrors in Detroit stands as a reminder that we must be vigilant, we must report suspicions, and we must never assume that a mother could not do the unthinkable, because sometimes she can, and sometimes she does. Case 6. Michelle Kehoe. On October 26, 2008, Michelle Kehoe told her husband, Eugene, that she was taking their two sons, 7-year-old Sean and 2-year-old Seth, to visit relatives in Sumner, Iowa. It was supposed to be a routine family visit. Eugene kissed his wife and boys goodbye and went to work. He expected them home that evening. They never came back. The next morning, Michelle walked into a stranger's home in Littleton, covered in blood, and said her sons were in danger. When police found the family van, 2-year-old Seth was dead outside the vehicle, his throat slashed. 7-year-old Sean was inside, barely alive, with similar wounds. There had been no abduction, no attack by strangers. Michelle had done this to her own children, and when investigators asked her why, she could not explain. Michelle Kehoe was 36 years old in 2008. She was a stay-at-home mother living with her husband Eugene and their two sons in Coralville, Iowa. To those who knew the family, they seemed ordinary. Eugene worked to support the household. Michelle took care of the children and the home. There were no obvious signs of trouble, no reports of domestic violence, no indicators that anything was seriously wrong. The Kehoes were just another family navigating the challenges of raising two young boys. On October 26th, Michelle loaded Sean and Seth into the family van and left for what she told Eugene was a visit to relatives. She drove northeast from Coralville towards Sumner. But at some point during that drive, Michelle's intentions changed. She did not go to visit relatives. Instead, she drove to a rural area near Littleton, a small town in northeast Iowa. What happened next would destroy her family forever. Michelle pulled the van over on a quiet road. She had brought duct tape and a knife. She took Sean and Seth and began carrying out an act of violence that defies comprehension. She used the knife to slash both boys' throats. 2-year-old Seth's wounds were catastrophic. The knife cut deep into his neck, severing vital structures. 7-year-old Sean suffered similar injuries, though not quite as severe. Both children were bleeding profusely. Michelle then inflicted wounds on herself, cutting her own wrists and throat to support the story she was planning to tell. Seth died from his injuries outside the van. His small body was left on the ground near the vehicle, his life ended by his mother's hand. Sean, though gravely wounded, remained conscious. He was inside the van, bleeding and in shock, but alive. Michelle left him there. Michelle then drove or walked to a nearby home in Littleton. It was the morning of October 27th. She approached the house and knocked on the door. When residents answered, they were confronted with a blood-covered woman who told them her sons were in danger. She said they needed help. She gave an address where the boys could be found. The residents immediately called 911. Emergency responders and police rushed to the location Michelle had provided. They found the family van on a rural road. Outside the vehicle was Seth's body. The 2-year-old was already dead. Inside the van, they found Sean. The 7-year-old had severe lacerations to his neck and was barely clinging to life. Paramedics worked frantically to stabilize him. The wounds suggested someone had tried to kill him by cutting his throat. He was rushed to the hospital for emergency surgery. Police also attended to Michelle. She had wounds on her wrists and throat, though investigators quickly noted they appeared superficial compared to the children's injuries. She was treated at a hospital and placed under police supervision. Detectives needed to understand what had happened. Eugene Kehoe had already reported his family missing. When Michelle and the boys did not return home on the evening of October 26th, he grew concerned. He called relatives to see if they had arrived. No one had seen them. He reported them missing to police. Now, less than 24 hours later, he was learning that his youngest son was dead and his older son was fighting for his life. His wife was the primary suspect. As Sean underwent emergency surgery, investigators began piecing together what had happened. Michelle initially told a story about being attacked, about someone threatening her and her children. But her story did not hold together. The physical evidence did not match her account. The location where the van was found, the pattern of injuries, the timeline, nothing supported a narrative of external attack. Everything pointed to Michelle herself. Detectives interviewed Michelle more extensively once she was medically cleared. She changed her story multiple times. She offered different versions of events, each one falling apart under scrutiny. Finally, faced with overwhelming evidence, Michelle stopped trying to maintain the fiction. She admitted she had attacked her sons. She had used a knife to slash their throats. She had killed Seth and attempted to kill Sean. But when investigators asked why she had done it, Michelle had no answer. She could not explain her actions. She said she did not know what had made her hurt her children. She expressed that she could not articulate a reason or motive. This lack of explanation would become one of the most troubling aspects of the case. Michelle Kehoe had committed an act of horrific violence against her own children, and she could not say why. Sean survived his injuries, though he required extensive medical treatment and surgery. The 7-year-old had come terrifyingly close to death. Had the cuts been slightly deeper, or had help arrived minutes later, he would have died alongside his brother. As Sean recovered physically, he also had to process the psychological trauma of what had happened. His mother had attacked him. She had killed his little brother. He had witnessed and experienced violence that no child should ever know. Michelle was arrested and charged with first-degree murder for Seth's death and attempted murder for the attack on Sean. She was held without bond. The charges carried mandatory life sentences. Prosecutors made clear they would seek the maximum penalties available under Iowa law. The case proceeded through the legal system. Michelle's defense attorneys faced an extraordinarily difficult task. Their client had admitted to the crimes. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The surviving victim could testify. There was no viable defense based on the facts. The only possible avenue was to argue mental illness or diminished capacity. Mental health experts examined Michelle to assess her psychological state. They found no clear diagnosis that would explain her actions. She was not psychotic. She did not have schizophrenia or severe delusional disorder. She was not experiencing a complete break from reality. The experts could identify depression and stress, but nothing that rose to the level of legal insanity or that clearly explained why she would murder her children. The prosecution argued that Michelle had committed a calculated act of violence. She had brought weapons. She had driven to an isolated location. She had carried out the attacks and then staged a scene to try to deflect blame. These actions demonstrated planning and intent. Whatever had motivated Michelle, she had acted with sufficient awareness to attempt to cover up what she had done. Michelle's trial drew significant attention in Iowa. The brutality of the crimes and the inexplicable nature of Michelle's actions made the case particularly disturbing. Members of the community struggled to understand how a mother could slash her children's throats. Eugene Kehoe, devastated by the loss of his son and the betrayal by his wife, attended court proceedings. The jury heard testimony about the events of October 26 and 27, 2008. They saw photographs of the crime scene and of the children's injuries. Medical examiners described Seth's wounds and the cause of death. Doctors who had treated Sean testified about his injuries and his recovery. The evidence painted a picture of deliberate, brutal violence. Sean himself provided testimony, though the process was handled with care given his young age and trauma. He described what his mother had done. He remembered the attack. His testimony was devastating. Here was a child who had survived his mother's attempt to kill him, now having to recount those events in a courtroom. The jury listened to a 7-year-old boy describe how his mother had hurt him and killed his brother. Michelle took the stand in her own defense. She admitted she had attacked her sons. She said she regretted what she had done, but when asked to explain why she had committed such violence, she could only say she did not know. She could not identify a triggering event, a breakdown, a moment of decision. She described her actions as if they had been committed by someone else, as if she could not understand her own behavior. The lack of explanation troubled everyone involved in the case. Jurors, lawyers, the judge, observers, all wanted to understand what had driven Michelle to such violence, but no satisfactory answer emerged. Michelle either could not or would not articulate why she had tried to murder her children. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty on all charges. Michelle was convicted of first-degree murder for killing Seth and attempted murder for attacking Sean. The convictions carried mandatory sentences. In Iowa, first-degree murder requires a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. At sentencing, the judge addressed Michelle directly. He spoke about the innocence of the victims, about Seth, who had been only 2 years old, about Sean, who had barely survived. He noted that Michelle had been in a position of trust and care as the boy's mother, and she had violated that trust in the most fundamental way. He sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Michelle Kehoe was transferred to the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women to begin serving her sentence. She remains incarcerated there today. She will never be released. She will spend the rest of her life in prison for killing one son and attempting to kill the other. The impact on the surviving family members has been profound. Eugene Kehoe lost his youngest son and saw his older son permanently scarred by trauma. He also lost his wife, though not to death but to prison and to the incomprehensible actions she had taken. He was left to raise Sean alone, to help the boy process what had happened, and to try to rebuild some semblance of normal life. Sean has had to grow up knowing his mother tried to kill him. He carries physical scars from the attack and deeper psychological wounds. He lost his little brother. He lost the security and trust that children should be able to have in their parents. Therapists have worked with Sean to help him cope with the trauma, but the effects of what happened will likely stay with him for life. The case highlighted the reality that not all instances of maternal violence come with clear explanations. Andrea Yates believed she was saving her children from hell. Susan Smith wanted a relationship without the burden of children. Mitchell Blair claimed her children had committed abuse. But Michelle Kehoe has never provided a coherent explanation for her actions. She simply said she could not explain why she did it. This lack of explanation is profoundly unsettling. Society wants to understand such acts of violence. We look for reasons, for triggers, for explanations that help us make sense of the incomprehensible. When a mother kills her children, we search for the cause: mental illness, desperation, anger, revenge. But sometimes there is no satisfying explanation. Sometimes the person who committed the act cannot articulate why they did it. Mental health professionals have suggested that Michelle may have experienced a severe dissociative episode or a psychological break that she does not fully remember or understand. Others have proposed that the violence erupted from depression or stressors that she had not expressed or acknowledged. Still others believe she may know why she did it, but cannot bring herself to voice the reason. Without Michelle's cooperation or insight, the question remains unanswered. The case also serves as a reminder that maternal mental health issues can be hidden and undiagnosed. If Michelle was experiencing psychological distress before the attack, she did not seek help or did not receive adequate intervention. Friends and family reported no obvious warning signs. Eugene said he had not noticed anything that alarmed him. Yet something inside Michelle had broken badly enough that she attempted to murder her children. The disconnect between the outward appearance of normalcy and the internal reality that led to violence is deeply troubling. Seth Kehoe was 2 years old when his mother killed him. He was a toddler, barely beginning to experience life. He trusted his mother completely. She was supposed to protect him, care for him, keep him safe. Instead, she ended his life on a rural Iowa road for reasons she cannot or will not explain. His death was senseless and preventable. He deserved better than to die at his mother's hand. Sean Kehoe survived, but his survival came at tremendous cost. He will always carry the knowledge that his mother attacked him, that she killed his brother, that his family was destroyed by violence that came from within. As he grows older, he will continue to grapple with those realities. The resilience children show in the face of trauma is remarkable, but the burden Sean carries is heavy. Michelle Kehoe sits in prison today, more than 15 years after she slashed her son's throats. She has offered no new explanations for her actions. She has not provided the understanding that Sean, Eugene, and society have sought. Her case remains one of maternal violence without a clear motive, an act of horror that defies comprehension. The absence of explanation does not make the crime any less real or the pain any less severe. Seth is still dead. Sean still bears the scars. And Michelle will spend the rest of her life behind bars, unable to answer the simplest and most important question, why did you do it? Case 7, Leanne Smith. On the evening of May 17, 2010, Leanne Smith checked into the Miramar Hotel on Spain's Costa Brava with her 2 youngest children, 5-year-old Rebecca and 11-month-old Daniel. She told the hotel staff she was fleeing Barcelona and needed a place to stay. That night, she suffocated both children with plastic shopping bags as they slept. She then spent hours trying to end her own life through cutting, suffocation, hanging, and drowning. When all her suicide attempts failed, she lay down in bed beside her dead children and went to sleep. The next afternoon, she calmly walked to the hotel reception and asked staff to call police and an ambulance. What made this case particularly devastating was not just the murders, but who Leanne Smith was and why she had killed her children. She was a former child services manager who had spent years protecting children professionally. Now she had murdered her own to prevent them from being taken by social services, the very system she once represented. Leanne Smith was born in England and built a career in child protection services. She worked for Cumbria County Council's Children's Services Department, rising to a management position. Her job was to safeguard vulnerable children, to identify abuse, and to intervene when families failed. She understood the system intimately. She knew how investigations worked, what triggered interventions, and what happened when children were removed from homes. That knowledge would later shape the terrible decisions she made. In the early 1990s, Leanne met Martin Smith, a man who presented himself as a television psychic and hypnotist. They were not married but began a relationship and had children together. Leanne had 2 older children from a previous relationship, a daughter named Sarah and a son named Chris. With Martin, she had Rebecca in 2004 and Daniel in 2009. To outside observers, they appeared to be a blended family living a relatively normal life in Cumbria. Behind closed doors, Martin Smith was systematically sexually abusing Sarah, Leanne's daughter from her previous relationship. The abuse began in the mid-1990s when Sarah was a child and continued for years. Martin used his supposed skills in hypnotism, along with physical violence and psychological manipulation, to control and abuse the girl. Sarah later described a childhood of terror and violation. And Leanne knew. She knew Martin was abusing her daughter, and she did nothing to stop it. In 2007, Sarah finally found the courage to report the abuse to police. She told authorities what Martin had been doing to her for over a decade. Police in England began investigating Martin Smith for child sexual abuse. They sought to question him and build a case for prosecution. Rather than cooperate with the investigation or protect her daughter, Leanne made a choice. She fled the country with Martin in December 2007. Leanne and Martin took Rebecca, then 3 years old, and left England. They settled in Spain, moving to the Barcelona area. Sarah, the daughter who had been abused and had reported it, was left behind. Leanne had chosen her abusive partner over her victimized child. She had enabled a pedophile for years and now was helping him escape justice. Daniel was born in Spain in 2009, adding another child to the family living in exile. For more than 2 years, Leanne and Martin lived in Spain, while English authorities continued investigating the allegations against him. Martin had been placed on the United Kingdom's most wanted list. Spanish police were eventually notified through international law enforcement channels that Martin Smith was wanted on serious charges of child sexual abuse. A European arrest warrant was issued. On May 7, 2010, Spanish police arrested Martin Smith in Barcelona. They executed the warrant and took him into custody. He would be extradited to the United Kingdom to face charges of rape of a child under 16, gross indecency with a girl under 16, indecent assault, and attempted rape. The arrest triggered a cascade of events that would end in tragedy. Leanne panicked. She became convinced that British social services had traveled to Spain to take Rebecca and Daniel away from her. She believed that with Martin arrested and their family exposed, authorities would remove her children. As someone who had worked in child services, she knew that the children of a known sex offender would be subject to protective measures. She knew investigations would examine whether she had protected her children or exposed them to risk. She knew what happened in such cases. On May 15th, 2 days before the murders, Leanne fled Barcelona with Rebecca and Daniel. She drove to Lloret de Mar on the Costa Brava and checked into the Miramar Hotel. She paid for the room and told staff she needed somewhere safe. She seemed agitated and frightened. Over the next 2 days, Leanne spent time with her children on the beach. She later described these outings as giving them a perfect last day. She was planning what came next. On the evening of May 17th, Leanne put Rebecca and Daniel to bed in the hotel room. She had purchased plastic shopping bags. She waited until the children were asleep. Then, at approximately 9:30 p.m., she placed a plastic bag over 11-month-old Daniel's head and held it there until he stopped breathing. She then did the same to 5-year-old Rebecca. The little girl woke and struggled, but Leanne held the bag over her head until she died. Both children were suffocated in their beds. After killing Rebecca and Daniel, Leanne attempted to kill herself. She used razors to cut her wrists and arms. She covered her own head with a plastic bag. She tried to hang herself using telephone cables. She attempted to drown herself in the bathtub, but each attempt failed. She could not manage to end her own life despite trying multiple methods over several hours. Finally, exhausted and bleeding from self-inflicted wounds, she gave up. Leanne wrote notes explaining what she had done. She left one note addressed to Rebecca and Daniel that read, "I love you very much. I wanted to give you a lovely life together. I'm very sorry." She left money and additional notes for the hotel management, apologizing for what she was leaving them to deal with. Then she lay down in the bed next to her dead children and went to sleep. The next day, May 18th, Leanne woke up. Her children were still dead beside her. She had survived the night despite her suicide attempts. At approximately 1:30 p.m., she walked down to the hotel reception. She calmly told staff that they needed to call police and an ambulance. She said there were dead children in her room. The receptionist was confused and alarmed. Leanne remained calm and emotionless as she explained. Police arrived within minutes. Officers went to Leanne's room and found the bodies of 2 young children in the beds. They were covered with sheets, and under those sheets were small forms that had been dead for hours. The scene was disturbing in its orderliness. The children looked like they were sleeping. The room was neat. There were notes explaining what had happened. And downstairs was a mother who showed no visible emotion about what she had done. Leanne was arrested immediately. She was taken into custody and formally charged with 2 counts of murder. She confessed fully to what she had done. She told investigators she had killed Rebecca and Daniel because she believed social services would take them away. She said she could not bear to be separated from her children, and she thought killing them was better than letting them be removed. She described the murders in detail, including how the children had died and how she had spent the night with their bodies. Spanish authorities notified British police about the murders and about Martin Smith's arrest. The case gained international attention. A British woman had killed her children in Spain to prevent them from being taken by Child Protective Services. The fact that she had worked in child services herself added a layer of bitter irony to the tragedy. Martin Smith was extradited to the United Kingdom, where he faced trial on the sexual abuse charges involving Sarah. In December 2010, he was convicted at Manchester Crown Court of using hypnotism, physical violence, and psychological coercion to groom and sexually abuse Leanne's daughter over many years. The jury heard testimony about the systematic abuse Sarah had endured. Martin was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. While in custody, in January 2011, Martin Smith hanged himself in his cell at Strangeways Prison in Manchester. He died by suicide, never having faced Leanne or taken responsibility for how his actions had contributed to the deaths of Rebecca and Daniel. Leanne's trial began in Spain in June 2012. She faced 2 counts of murder under Spanish law. Her defense team argued that she should be acquitted by reason of insanity. They presented evidence of her severe mental distress following Martin's arrest, her paranoid beliefs about social services, and her psychiatric history. They argued she had been in a state of insurmountable fear when she killed the children and that her mental illness prevented her from forming criminal intent. The prosecution argued that Leanne's actions had been deliberate and calculated. They pointed out that she had planned the trip to Lloret de Mar, checked into a hotel, spent days with the children, and then methodically killed them. After the murders, she had written coherent notes and made rational decisions about what to do with her belongings. She had waited until the next day to alert authorities, suggesting she had maintained awareness of her actions and their consequences. Prosecutors said this was not insanity, but a selfish decision to kill her children rather than face losing custody of them. The jury heard testimony about Leanne's background in child services. They learned she had spent years working to protect children, yet had enabled a pedophile to abuse her daughter. They heard about how she had fled England rather than cooperate with the investigation into Martin. They learned about the plastic bags, the suffocation, and the night Leanne spent sleeping next to her dead children. The evidence painted a picture of a woman who had made terrible choices repeatedly, culminating in the murder of 2 innocent children. On June 19, 2012, the jury found Leanne Smith guilty of 2 counts of murder. They rejected the insanity defense. The verdict meant Leanne would face significant prison time. In Spain, murder convictions typically result in sentences of 15 to 20 years per count. Judge Adolfo Garcia Morales was responsible for sentencing. On July 3, 2012, Judge Morales sentenced Leanne to 30 years in prison, 15 years for each murder. He imposed the minimum sentence available because he found that Leanne had been experiencing some degree of mental disturbance at the time of the crimes, even if it did not rise to the level of legal insanity. He acknowledged her psychiatric issues, but concluded that her actions had been deliberate. He specifically rejected the defense claim of insurmountable fear, noting that if she truly feared social services taking her children, the logical response would have been to resist or flee, not to kill the children herself. Leanne was transferred to a Spanish prison to serve her sentence. She remains incarcerated there. Under Spanish law, she will be eligible for parole after serving a portion of her sentence, but she must serve a substantial minimum term. She is now in her late 50s and will be elderly before she has any possibility of release. The case sparked intense debate in both Britain and Spain. Many people struggled to understand how a former child protection worker could kill her own children. The irony was inescapable. Leanne had dedicated her career to safeguarding children from harm. She knew the signs of abuse, the importance of intervention, and the purpose of removing children from dangerous situations. Yet when faced with the possibility that her own children might be taken into care, she chose to murder them rather than allow the system to protect them. Critics argued that Leanne's actions revealed she had never truly understood the purpose of child protection. The system exists to save children from harm, not to punish parents. Rebecca and Daniel would have been safe in foster care or with relatives. They would have grown up, had lives, had futures. Instead, Leanne decided that death was preferable to separation. That decision exposed a fundamental selfishness. She prioritized her own desire to keep her children over their right to live. The case also highlighted Leanne's complicity in Martin's abuse of Sarah. She had known about the sexual abuse and had done nothing to stop it. When Sarah finally reported it, Leanne had fled with Martin rather than support her daughter. She had chosen a pedophile over a victimized child. That pattern of enabling abuse and protecting the abuser continued until it culminated in the murders of Rebecca and Daniel. Leanne's distorted thinking, shaped by years of being controlled by Martin, led her to see authorities as the threat, rather than recognizing that Martin himself was the danger. Sarah Richardson, Leanne's oldest daughter who had been abused by Martin, later waived her right to anonymity to speak about the case. She expressed grief over the deaths of her half-siblings, Rebecca and Daniel. She also spoke about the betrayal of having a mother who chose an abuser over protecting her children. Sarah has had to live with the knowledge that her mother enabled her abuse for years and then killed two of her siblings rather than face the consequences of those choices. Rebecca and Daniel Smith would be teenagers now if their mother had not killed them. Rebecca would be 19 years old. Daniel would be 15. They never had the chance to grow up because Leanne decided their lives should end rather than be lived without her. Her paranoid belief that social services would harm them rather than protect them cost them everything. The Miramar hotel room where the murders occurred became a place of sadness for staff and guests. The hotel continued operating, but the knowledge of what happened in that room remained. The image of Leanne, sleeping calmly next to her dead children after spending hours trying to kill herself, became one of the most haunting aspects of the case. It spoke to a disconnect between her ability to take her children's lives and her inability to take her own. Leanne Smith sits in a Spanish prison today, more than a decade after she suffocated Rebecca and Daniel. She took the lives of two children who trusted her completely. She used her knowledge of the child protection system to convince herself that killing her children was the right choice. She was wrong. Rebecca and Daniel deserved to live. They deserved protection from the predator Leanne had brought into their lives. They deserved a mother who would cooperate with authorities rather than flee. Instead, they got plastic bags over their heads in a hotel room on the Costa Brava, killed by the woman who should have kept them safe. That is the legacy of Leanne Smith, a child protection worker who became a child killer, a mother who chose death over life for the children she claimed to love. Case 8. Hak Young Lee. In August 2022, a family in Auckland, New Zealand purchased the contents of an abandoned storage unit at an online auction. They had won the bid without knowing what was inside, hoping to find items they could resell or use. When they opened the unit and began sorting through boxes, they made a discovery that would haunt them forever. Inside 2 suitcases were the bodies of 2 children, wrapped in plastic and decomposed from years of storage. Police launched a murder investigation that would span 2 countries and 4 years. The children were Minu Jo, 6 years old, and Yuna Jo, 8 years old. Their mother, Hak Young Lee, had poisoned them in 2018, packed their bodies in luggage, and stored them in a facility before fleeing to South Korea. The case became known as New Zealand's Suitcase Murders, a tragedy born from grief so profound it twisted into something unthinkable. Hak Young Lee was born in South Korea and later became a New Zealand citizen. She married and settled in Auckland with her husband, building a life together in a country far from where she had grown up. The couple had 2 children, Yuna, born in 2010, and Minu, born in 2012. To those who knew them, they appeared to be a normal immigrant family working to establish themselves in New Zealand. Lee's husband held a job and supported the household. Lee took care of the children and the home. They lived quietly, not drawing particular attention. In 2017, Lee's husband was diagnosed with cancer. The illness progressed rapidly. Despite treatment, he deteriorated over the course of the year. Lee watched her husband suffer and decline. She became his primary caregiver while also caring for their 2 young children. The stress and emotional toll were immense. In 2017, Lee's husband died. Lee was suddenly a widow in a foreign country with 2 young children and no partner to help her navigate life. The grief that followed was overwhelming. Lee fell into severe depression. She struggled with the loss of her husband and the fear of raising children alone. She was isolated with limited support systems. As someone who had immigrated to New Zealand, she may have felt disconnected from extended family and cultural community. The weight of single parenthood, combined with profound grief, created a psychological crisis that Lee was not equipped to handle. In June 2018, approximately 1 year after her husband's death, Lee made a decision that would end her children's lives. She obtained prescription medication, likely her own antidepressants or other drugs she had access to, and mixed an overdose into fruit juice. She gave the poisoned juice to Yuna and Minu. The children drank it, not knowing what their mother had done. The medication caused them to lose consciousness and eventually stop breathing. 8-year-old Yuna and 6-year-old Minu died in their home from the overdose. Lee later told authorities she had planned to kill herself along with the children. She said she had wanted them all to die together, unable to face life without her husband and unable to imagine her children growing up without their father. But something went wrong with her plan. She claimed she got the dosage wrong, that she had taken medication intending to die but had not taken enough to kill herself. She survived, while her children did not. After Yuna and Minu died, Lee was left with their bodies and her own survival. She wrapped each child's body in plastic bags. She then placed them in suitcases, 1 child in each piece of luggage. She sealed the suitcases and transported them to a storage facility in Auckland. She rented a storage unit and placed the suitcases inside, hiding her children's bodies in a space where no one would look. She then returned to her life, living with the knowledge that her children's remains were stored in a facility across the city. Lee continued living in Auckland for some time after the murders, but as financial pressures mounted and the weight of what she had done consumed her, she made plans to flee. In 2018, shortly after killing her children, Lee traveled back to South Korea. She changed her name and attempted to disappear into her home country. She left New Zealand behind, along with the storage unit containing her children's bodies. For 4 years, the suitcases sat in that unit, undisturbed and unknown. Lee stopped paying the rental fees for the storage unit. The storage facility company followed their standard procedures for non-payment. After repeated attempts to contact Lee and collect payment, they eventually took possession of the unit's contents. The items, including the suitcases, were put up for auction online. The facility had no idea what was inside the luggage. They simply auctioned off what appeared to be a storage unit full of personal belongings. In August 2022, a family purchased the contents of the unit. They arrived to collect their purchase and began going through the items. When they opened the suitcases, they were met with a horrific smell and the sight of human remains. They immediately called police. What they thought would be a routine auction purchase had turned into a nightmare. They had inadvertently bought the bodies of 2 murdered children. Auckland police responded to the scene and confirmed the remains were human. Forensic examination revealed they were the bodies of 2 children who had been dead for several years. The level of decomposition was significant, but investigators were able to determine the bodies had been deliberately concealed. This was a homicide case, not an accident or natural death. Police launched a full investigation into the identities of the children and how they had ended up in a storage unit. Through forensic analysis and investigation, police identified the children as Mainu Joe and Yuna Joe. They traced the storage unit rental to Hakyung Lee. They discovered Lee had left New Zealand in 2018 and had traveled to South Korea. International cooperation between New Zealand and South Korean authorities began immediately. New Zealand police issued a request for Lee's extradition to face murder charges. South Korean authorities located Lee, who was living under her changed name. She was arrested in South Korea in 2022 and held pending extradition. The legal process took time, but eventually South Korea agreed to extradite Lee to New Zealand to stand trial. In November 2022, Lee was transported back to Auckland and formally charged with 2 counts of murder. Lee's trial began in September 2025. She pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Her defense team argued that she had been in such a severe state of mental distress following her husband's death that she had not been capable of understanding right from wrong. They presented evidence of her profound depression, her isolation, and her grief. They argued she had experienced a psychotic break and that her actions were the result of mental illness rather than criminal intent. Lee represented herself during portions of the trial, though she had 2 standby lawyers to assist her. She spoke about her husband's death, her inability to cope, and her belief that her children would be better off dead than living without their father. She described feeling completely overwhelmed and unable to see any path forward. She said she had wanted to die with them, that the plan had been for all 3 of them to be together in death. The prosecution presented a very different picture. Crown Prosecutor Natalie Walker argued that Lee's actions after the murders demonstrated calculated thinking, not insanity. Lee had carefully wrapped the bodies, purchased or obtained suitcases, transported them to a storage facility, and rented the unit. She had then fled to South Korea and changed her name to avoid detection. These were not the actions of someone who was completely out of touch with reality. They were the actions of someone who knew exactly what she had done and was trying to avoid consequences. The prosecution argued that Lee's decision to kill her children was selfish. She had not been acting out of altruistic concern for their well-being. She had been acting out of her own inability to cope with widowhood and single parenthood. Rather than seek help, reach out to family, or access mental health services, she had chosen to end her children's lives. The fact that she survived while they died undermined her claim that this was meant to be a murder-suicide where everyone died together. The jury heard testimony from forensic pathologists who explained how the children had died. They heard from investigators who described the scene at the storage unit and the condition of the bodies after 4 years. They heard from mental health experts on both sides, defense experts who argued Lee had been insane, prosecution experts who argued she had known what she was doing. The trial was emotionally difficult for everyone involved. On September 23, 2025, after just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Hak-Young Lee guilty of 2 counts of murder. They rejected the insanity defense. The verdict meant Lee would face a mandatory life sentence under New Zealand law. Judge Jeffrey Venning ordered her to remain in custody pending sentencing. On November 25, 2025, Judge Venning sentenced Lee. He acknowledged that she had been experiencing severe depression at the time of the murders. He noted the loss of her husband and the difficult circumstances she faced, but he concluded that her actions had been deliberate and that the children had been particularly vulnerable victims who had depended on their mother for protection. He sentenced Lee to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years. This meant Lee would spend at least 17 years in prison before she could even apply for parole. Judge Venning also ordered that Lee begin her sentence at a secure psychiatric facility under New Zealand's compulsory mental health treatment law. She would receive psychiatric care while being held securely. Once mental health professionals determined she was stable enough, she would be transferred to a regular prison to serve the remainder of her sentence. This hybrid approach acknowledged her mental health needs while ensuring she served time for her crimes. The sentencing hearing included victim impact statements from Lee's family. Her mother, Chun-Ja Lee, spoke through a prosecutor about the devastating impact of learning what had happened to her grandchildren. She described pain that felt like her bones were being cut or her chest gouged out. She said she might carry that pain until she died. The children's uncle, Jimmy Se-wook Jo, spoke about feeling he had failed to protect his niece and nephew. The family's grief was compounded by the knowledge that Lee had not only killed the children, but had hidden their bodies for years. The case raised difficult questions about mental health support for immigrants dealing with grief and trauma. Lee had lost her husband and spiraled into depression, but there was no indication she had accessed mental health services or reached out for help. Whether this was due to stigma around mental illness in her culture, language barriers, financial constraints, or simply her own inability to recognize she needed help remains unclear. What is clear is that 2 children died because their mother's mental health crisis went untreated. The 4-year gap between the murders and the discovery of the bodies added a particularly disturbing element to the case. For 4 years, Yuna and Minu's bodies lay in suitcases in a storage unit, while life continued around them. Other customers accessed their own units nearby. Storage facility staff walked past the unit. Lee lived her life in South Korea, and inside those suitcases were 2 children who had been poisoned by their mother and hidden away like unwanted belongings. The family who purchased the storage unit and discovered the bodies were innocent victims of the case as well. They will carry the trauma of that discovery for the rest of their lives. They had been looking for a good deal at an auction and instead found dead children. The psychological impact of such a discovery is significant. The fact that they had to open the suitcases and see what was inside before understanding what they had found makes it even worse. Yuna Jo would be 16 years old today if her mother had not killed her. Minu Jo would be 13. They would be teenagers, attending school, making friends, building their lives in New Zealand. Instead, they died at ages 8 and 6, poisoned by a mother who decided their lives should end because hers felt too difficult to continue. Lee claimed she loved her children and wanted to be with them in death, but her actions after they died tell a different story. She packed them in suitcases, hid them in a storage unit, and fled to another country. Those are not the actions of a loving mother overcome by grief. They are the actions of someone trying to hide evidence of a crime. The case has been referred to as the New Zealand Suitcase Murders, a name that captures the shocking nature of how the children's bodies were found. It stands as one of the most disturbing cases in New Zealand's recent criminal history. The image of two small bodies packed in luggage and stored for years is difficult to process. It reduces children to objects, strips them of dignity, and represents a complete failure of maternal protection. Hak Young Lee is now in her late 40s, serving a life sentence that will keep her incarcerated until at least 2042, when she will be in her 60s. She has the possibility of parole after 17 years, but given the nature of her crimes and the fact that she fled the country after committing them, it is far from certain she will ever be released. She will grow old in prison, serving time for poisoning her children and hiding their bodies in suitcases. The case serves as a reminder that grief, even profound grief, does not justify violence. Losing a spouse is devastating. Facing single parenthood is overwhelming. But millions of widows and widowers around the world raise children alone without resorting to murder. Lee had options. She could have reached out to family in South Korea. She could have accessed grief counseling and mental health services. She could have allowed others to help her and her children through their loss. Instead, she decided the solution was death. That decision cost Yuna and Minu everything. They lost their father to cancer. Then, they lost their mother to grief and desperation. And finally, they lost their lives to poisoned fruit juice and a mother who saw no future worth living. The tragedy of the suitcase murders is that it was entirely preventable. 2 children died not because there was no help available, but because their mother chose not to seek it. Case 9. Darlie Routier. At 2:31 a.m. on June 6, 1996, a frantic 911 call came from a home in Rowlett, a quiet suburb of Dallas. A woman screamed that someone had broken into her house and stabbed her and her children. When police arrived at 5801 Eagle Drive within 3 minutes, they found a scene of horror. 6-year-old Devin Routier was already dead, stabbed multiple times in the chest. 5-year-old Damon was still alive but barely, with deep knife wounds. Their mother, 26-year-old Darlie Routier, had a slash across her throat and stab wounds to her arm. She told officers an intruder had attacked them while they slept. But as investigators examined the evidence, they reached a different conclusion. They believed Darlie had staged the scene and murdered her own sons. Nearly 3 decades later, she sits on death row maintaining her innocence, while supporters and critics continue to debate whether Texas got the verdict right. Darlie and Darren Routier had seemed like the perfect suburban couple. They lived in a 2-story brick home in an upscale Rowlett neighborhood. Darren owned a small business testing electronic circuit boards. Darlie was a stay-at-home mother to their 3 sons, Devin, Damon, and 7-month-old Drake. To neighbors and friends, they appeared happy and successful. Darlie was attractive and social. She threw parties, decorated elaborately for holidays, and seemed devoted to her children. The family drove nice cars and lived in a nice home. From the outside, everything looked ideal. Behind the facade, the Routiers were struggling financially. Darren's business was failing. They had mounting debts and faced potential bankruptcy. The stress of financial problems weighed on the marriage, but outwardly they maintained appearances. No one suspected the family was in crisis. On the night of June 5, 1996, Darlie and Darren followed their usual routine. Darren went upstairs to bed around midnight. Darlie stayed downstairs in the family room with Devin and Damon, who often slept there. She later said she fell asleep on the couch while the boys slept nearby. Drake was upstairs in his crib. The house was quiet as the family settled in for the night. At some point in the early morning hours of June 6th, violence erupted in that family room. Devin and Damon were stabbed repeatedly with a large kitchen knife. Devin received multiple wounds to his chest that penetrated his heart and lungs. He died quickly. Damon was stabbed in the chest and back. One wound went through his body. He was critically injured, but alive. Darlie sustained a slash to her neck that came within 2 millimeters of her carotid artery, along with stab wounds to her arm. At 2:31 a.m., Darlie called 911. The call was chaotic and emotional. She screamed that someone had broken in and attacked them. The 911 operator tried to get information while Darlie yelled about her children bleeding. She said she had picked up the knife, though she later could not explain why. The call lasted almost 6 minutes. During that time, Damon was still alive but bleeding heavily. Medical examiners would later estimate he survived approximately 8 minutes after receiving his fatal wound. Police and paramedics arrived to a scene that would be analyzed and debated for years. Devon was clearly deceased. Damon was rushed to the hospital but died shortly after arrival. Darlie was treated for her wounds, which were serious but not life-threatening. She told first responders that an intruder had attacked them. She described a man with bushy hair who had walked through the family room, stabbed her and the boys, and then fled through the garage. As police processed the scene, certain details caught their attention. A window screen in the garage had been cut, which would support an intruder entering the home. But the dust and debris on the windowsill showed no signs of disturbance, suggesting no one had actually climbed through. A sock containing blood from both boys was found 75 yards from the house in an alley, which seemed to support the intruder theory. But investigators questioned how an intruder would have time to run down the alley with the sock while Darlie was calling 911. Crime scene analysts examined blood spatter patterns throughout the family room. They found evidence that raised questions about Darlie's account. Her blood was found in unusual locations. There was blood on her nightshirt that suggested different movements than what she described. A bread knife on the kitchen counter had fibers from the cut window screen on it, suggesting the screen had been cut from inside, not outside. A vacuum cleaner had been placed on top of bloody footprints, indicating it was moved after the attack rather than before. Police also noted Darlie's behavior. First responders described her as unusually calm. Dr. Wilhite, who treated Devon at the hospital, later said Darlie showed no tears when informed of her son's death. She asked how Devon was doing with no visible emotional response. She made comments about the incident ruining her vacation and her car. Medical staff found her lack of maternal grief disturbing. Lieutenant David Neighbors, the crime scene supervisor, felt something was wrong from the beginning. The scene looked staged. Too many elements did not fit a genuine intruder attack. The lack of a clear entry or exit point, the superficial nature of Darlie's wounds compared to the boys' fatal injuries, the placement of evidence, all of it raised suspicions. As investigators dug deeper, they learned about the Routiers' financial problems. They discovered Darren had discussed staging a burglary for insurance money with Darlie's stepfather months earlier, though there was no evidence he had followed through. They interviewed friends who said the marriage had been under stress. They built a timeline that raised questions about whether Darlie's story was physically possible. The case against Darlie strengthened when investigators learned about events at the cemetery. 8 days after the murders, the Routiers held a graveside birthday party for Devon, who would have turned 7. Video footage showed Darlie laughing, spraying silly string on the graves, and appearing cheerful. The video was shocking to many who saw it. How could a mother whose sons had just been murdered appear so carefree at their graves? Darlie's defenders argued the video was taken out of context. Before the silly string celebration, the family had held a somber prayer service. Darlie explained she wanted to celebrate Devon's birthday the way he would have wanted. She was trying to honor her son, not mock his death. But the video became a powerful piece of evidence for prosecutors who argued it showed Darlie's lack of genuine grief. On June 18, 1996, Darlie Routier was arrested and charged with capital murder. She was accused of killing both Devon and Damon. though prosecutors would eventually focus only on Damon's murder in court. The case drew intense media attention. A mother accused of murdering her children while they slept was sensational news. Darlie maintained she was innocent, that an intruder had committed the crimes, and that police were framing her because they could not find the real killer. The trial was moved to Kerrville due to heavy pretrial publicity in the Dallas area. Proceedings began in January 1997. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence they said proved Darlie had murdered her sons and staged the scene. They argued financial stress had motivated the killings. They suggested Darlie had wanted to be free of the burden of children. They showed the jury the silly string video repeatedly, emphasizing that this was not how an innocent mother grieved. The defense argued Darlie was a loving mother who had no reason to kill her children. They noted the lack of a clear motive. They challenged the forensic evidence, suggesting it was subject to interpretation and that investigators had focused on Darlie too quickly instead of pursuing other leads. They emphasized that Darlie herself had been seriously injured in the attack, with wounds that could have been fatal if slightly deeper. They argued no mother would cut her own throat to stage a crime scene. The defense also pointed out problems with the prosecution's timeline. According to medical testimony, Damon survived only about 8 minutes after his fatal wound. Darlie was on the phone with 911 for almost 6 minutes. The prosecution suggested she had staged the scene, cut herself, and called 911 in the brief window after stabbing the boys. The defense argued this timeline was nearly impossible and that Darlie would have had to act with incredible speed and calculation while bleeding from her own wounds. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Darlie Routier of capital murder in the death of Damon. They then had to decide her sentence, death or life in prison. They chose death. On February 4, 1997, Darlie was sentenced to death by lethal injection. She was transferred to death row at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas. Darlie has pursued appeals ever since. Her supporters have raised numerous questions about the case. They point to the bloody fingerprint found at the scene that did not match anyone in the family or any police officer. They note the bloody sock found in the alley contained DNA from both boys, suggesting someone had carried it there during the attack. They question the credibility of some forensic evidence, including blood spatter analysis, that has been challenged by experts. They argue Darlie's wounds were too serious to be self-inflicted. One juror, Charles Sanford, later signed an affidavit saying he regretted his vote to convict. He said the jury had not seen the full video from the cemetery, only the portion with the silly string. When he later saw the complete video showing the prayer service and obvious grief, he felt differently about the evidence. He said if the jury had seen the full context, he would not have voted to convict. In 2008, courts granted Darlie's request for additional DNA testing using technology that had not existed at the time of her trial. The testing has taken years and remains incomplete as of 2024. Results that have been disclosed have not definitively exonerated Darlie, but supporters argue complete testing of all evidence could prove her innocence. Critics of Darlie's conviction note several concerning aspects of the case. The crime scene was not properly preserved in the crucial early hours. Police focused on Darlie immediately rather than thoroughly investigating other possibilities. The prosecution's motive, that she killed her sons over money or to be free of them, seemed weak, given that she had a 7-month-old son upstairs who was unharmed. If she wanted to be free of children, why not harm all 3? However, prosecutors maintained the evidence of Darlie's guilt was overwhelming. The staged scene, the forensic evidence, the lack of any viable suspect besides Darlie, and her behavior all pointed to her responsibility. The conviction has been upheld through multiple appeals. Courts have found the evidence sufficient to support the jury's verdict. Darlie's case has been featured in numerous documentaries and television programs. Some portray her as likely guilty. Others suggest she may be innocent and wrongly convicted. The 2018 ABC documentary series The Last Defense examined her case and raised questions about the evidence. Public opinion remains divided. Darren Routier, Darlie's husband, initially supported her and insisted she was innocent. He testified on her behalf at trial. But the strain of the case eventually ended their marriage. They divorced in 2011. Darren has since remarried and maintains that Darlie did not kill their sons, though they no longer have a relationship. Drake Routier, the baby who survived that night, was raised by Darren's family. He is now an adult. He grew up without his serious mother and without his brothers, who were murdered when he was just an infant. The life he might have had as part of a normal family was destroyed that June morning. Devon and Damon Routier would be in their 30s now if they had lived. Instead, their lives ended when they were 6 and 5 years old. They were stabbed to death as they slept in their family room. Whether their mother killed them or an unknown intruder attacked the family remains the central question in a case that has never achieved full resolution in the public mind. Darlie Routier has now spent nearly 3 decades on death row. No execution date has been set. She continues to maintain her innocence. She insists an intruder attacked her family and that the real killer was never found. She believes the justice system failed her and that DNA evidence will eventually prove she did not murder her sons. The case of Darlie Routier is unique among the cases in this documentary because it remains genuinely contested. While she was convicted and sentenced to death, significant questions linger about the evidence and the investigation. This is not a case like Susan Smith or Andrea Yates, where guilt is unquestioned. Darlie has maintained innocence for 28 years. She has supporters who genuinely believe she is wrongly imprisoned. The incomplete DNA testing leaves open the possibility that new evidence could change the narrative. What is certain is that 2 young boys were brutally murdered in their home. Devon and Damon Routier died from knife wounds inflicted as they slept. Someone killed them. The jury determined that someone was their mother. Whether that verdict was correct is a question that continues to divide observers nearly 3 decades later. Darlie Routier waits on death row, hoping technology and time will vindicate her. The families of Devon and Damon live with grief and loss, regardless of who wielded the knife that killed them. And the debates about appropriate maternal grief, forensic evidence, and whether the justice system got it right or wrong continue unresolved. Case 10. Lindsay Lowe. On September 27, 2011, a 25-year-old woman named Lindsay Lowe locked herself in her family's bathroom and gave birth to twin boys. She was alone. She had told no one she was pregnant. Her parents were in the house, unaware their daughter was in labor just feet away from them. Within minutes of the twins' births, both infants were dead. Lindsay had smothered each baby immediately after delivery, cutting short 2 lives that had barely begun. She wrapped their bodies in towels, placed them in a laundry basket, and hid them in her room. The next day, when Lindsay went to the hospital for bleeding complications, medical staff realized she had recently given birth and alerted authorities. Police searched the family home and found the bodies of 2 newborn boys who had been killed by the mother who had just delivered them. The case exposed the devastating consequences of concealed pregnancy, religious shame, and a young woman's terror of disappointing her. Family. Lindsay Lowe grew up in Hendersonville, Tennessee, a city north of Nashville. She lived with her parents in what appeared to be a close-knit religious household. Lindsay was their daughter, living at home, even at age 25. To those who knew the family, they seemed traditional and faith-oriented. Church was important to them. Values and moral expectations were part of their family life. Lindsay had grown up in an environment where certain behaviors and choices carried significant weight. At some point in late 2010 or early 2011, Lindsay became pregnant. The circumstances of the pregnancy are not fully public, whether it resulted from a relationship, a casual encounter, or something else. What is known is that Lindsay made the decision to hide the pregnancy from everyone. She told no one, not her parents, not friends, not the father of the children, whoever he was. She went through the entire pregnancy alone and in secret. Concealing a pregnancy, especially to full term, requires deliberate effort. Lindsay wore loose clothing to hide her changing body. She avoided situations where her pregnancy might be noticed. She did not seek any prenatal care. She never saw a doctor or midwife. She never had an ultrasound or prenatal testing. She simply waited and hid what was happening to her body. The reasons for concealment can be complex. In Lindsay's case, fear appeared to be the primary motivation. She feared her parents' reaction. She feared disappointing them. She feared being judged for being pregnant outside of marriage. She feared the consequences of revealing what she had kept hidden for so long. As the pregnancy progressed, the fear likely intensified. With each passing month, it became harder to imagine telling the truth. The lie grew until it consumed her. On September 27, 2011, Lindsay went into labor. She was in her family's home in Hendersonville. Her parents were there, but Lindsay told them nothing. She went to the bathroom and locked the door. There, alone on the bathroom floor, she gave birth to her first son. The baby was born alive. He cried. He breathed. He was a living child who needed care and protection. Instead, Lindsay smothered him. She covered his nose and mouth until he stopped breathing. The infant died within minutes of being born. Then Lindsay gave birth to the second twin. He too was born alive. He too cried and breathed, and Lindsay smothered him as well, ending his life just as she had ended his brother's. Both newborn boys were dead in the bathroom, while Lindsay's parents remained in the house, unaware of what had just happened. Lindsay cleaned up as best she could. She wrapped the babies' bodies in towels. She placed them in a laundry basket and carried them to her room. She hid the basket, concealing the evidence of the births and the murders. She then tried to return to normal life, acting as if nothing had happened. For hours, the bodies of her newborn sons remained hidden in her room while the family went about their evening. The next day, September 28th, Lindsay experienced heavy bleeding, a complication from the unassisted delivery. She went to the hospital seeking medical treatment. When doctors examined her, they realized she had recently given birth. They asked where the baby was. Lindsay initially tried to maintain the deception, but medical staff knew she had delivered a child within the past day. They alerted police and social services. Law enforcement officers went to the Lowe family home and spoke with Lindsay's parents. The parents were shocked. They had not known their daughter was pregnant. They had not suspected anything was wrong. Police asked for permission to search the house. They went to Lindsay's room and found the laundry basket. Inside were the bodies of 2 newborn baby boys wrapped in towels. Lindsay was arrested at the hospital and charged with 2 counts of murder. The charges were serious and carried potential life sentences. Lindsay had not just failed to care for her newborns, she had actively killed them. The medical examiner confirmed both infants had been born alive and had died from asphyxiation. These were not stillbirths or natural deaths. They were homicides. The case attracted significant media attention in Tennessee and beyond. A young woman had concealed a pregnancy, given birth to twins alone, and immediately killed both babies. The circumstances raised difficult questions. Why had Lindsay hidden her pregnancy? Why had she not sought help? Why had she chosen to kill her children rather than place them for adoption or surrender them safely? Tennessee, like all states, has a safe haven law that allows parents to surrender newborn infants at designated locations without fear of prosecution. Fire stations, hospitals, and police stations accept babies, no questions asked. Lindsay could have given birth at a hospital where her sons would have received medical care. She could have placed them for adoption. She could have told her parents and sought support. Instead, she chose to give birth in secret and kill the babies immediately. Lindsay's defense attorneys argued that she had acted out of fear and psychological distress. They described her as a young woman who had been overwhelmed by shame and terror. The pregnancy had resulted from circumstances she could not cope with. The thought of telling her religious parents she was pregnant outside of marriage had been unbearable. She had made terrible decisions driven by panic rather than malice. Her attorneys suggested she needed mental health treatment, not life in prison. The prosecution argued that Lindsay had made calculated choices over many months. She had hidden the pregnancy deliberately. She had given birth alone by choice. And most importantly, she had killed 2 babies who were born alive and deserved to live. The prosecution emphasized that these were not spontaneous acts. Lindsay had smothered 1 baby, and then when the second was born, she had smothered him too. She'd had time between the births to reconsider, to call for help, to choose differently. She had not. The trial took place in 2012. Jurors heard testimony from medical professionals who explained that both babies had been viable and healthy. They heard from investigators who described finding the bodies hidden in the laundry basket. They saw photographs and heard evidence about the cause of death. They also heard about Lindsay's background, her family, and the pressures she faced. Lindsay's parents testified, expressing shock and heartbreak over what had happened. They struggled to reconcile the daughter they thought they knew with the person who had killed 2 newborns. They grappled with questions about whether they had created an environment where Lindsay felt she could not come to them for help. The family's pain was evident throughout the proceedings. The jury deliberated and found Lindsay Lowe guilty of 2 counts of murder. The conviction meant she would face significant prison time. In Tennessee, murder convictions typically result in lengthy sentences. The judge sentenced Lindsay to 2 life sentences to be served concurrently. She would be eligible for parole only after serving 51 years. At age 25, when sentenced, Lindsay would be 76 years old before she could even apply for parole. Lindsay was transferred to the Tennessee Prison for Women to begin serving her sentence. She has remained incarcerated there. She has attempted to seek a new trial, filing appeals arguing that her conviction was unjust or that she received inadequate legal representation. Those attempts have been unsuccessful. The conviction stands, and Lindsay continues serving her sentence. The case of Lindsay Lowe is an example of neonaticide, the killing of an infant within 24 hours of birth. Neonaticide cases often share common patterns. The mothers are typically young women who have concealed their pregnancies. They give birth alone and in secret. They kill the infant immediately, often by smothering or suffocation. They hide the body. When confronted, they express that they felt they had no other option. Researchers who study neonaticide have found that shame and fear are primary motivations. Women who conceal pregnancies often come from religious or strict family backgrounds where pregnancy outside of marriage is heavily stigmatized. They fear judgment, rejection, and loss of family support. As the pregnancy progresses, the fear intensifies until they convince themselves that killing the baby is the only way to solve the problem they face. The tragedy is that there are always other options. Safe haven laws exist specifically to prevent neonaticide. Adoption services are available. Even telling family members, as difficult as that conversation might be, is preferable to killing a newborn. But women in the grip of panic and shame do not always see those alternatives. They feel trapped with no way out except through violence. Lindsay's case also highlighted failures in support systems for women facing crisis pregnancies. She went through an entire pregnancy without medical care. No one noticed. No one asked questions. She was able to hide a twin pregnancy to full term while living with her parents. That suggests either a high level of deception on her part or a lack of attention from those around her. Either way, It represents a missed opportunity for intervention. Religious communities have grappled with cases like Lindsay's. When young women feel they cannot tell their families about pregnancies because of religious expectations, that pressure can lead to devastating outcomes. Churches and faith communities have worked to create environments where young people feel they can seek help rather than hide in shame. But changing culture and attitudes is difficult, especially when deeply held beliefs about sexuality and morality are involved. The two baby boys Lindsay killed never received names. They are identified in court documents simply as the twin infants, born on September 27, 2011. They lived for minutes, long enough to cry, to breathe, to exist as separate human beings. Then their mother ended their lives before anyone else knew they had been born. They never had a chance to be held by someone who wanted them, to be fed, to be loved, to grow up. Their entire existence consisted of being born and being killed. Lindsay Lowe will likely spend most or all of her remaining life in prison. She is now in her late 30s, having served more than a decade of her sentence. She has at least 40 more years before parole eligibility. The twins she killed would be teenagers now if they had lived. They might have been raised by adoptive parents who desperately wanted children. They might have grown up happy and loved. Instead, they died in a bathroom, smothered by a mother who saw them as problems to be eliminated rather than children to be cherished. The case serves as a stark reminder that shame and fear can lead people to make unthinkable choices. Lindsay Lowe was not a monster. She was a frightened young woman who made a series of terrible decisions driven by panic and inability to cope with her situation. That does not excuse what she did. It does not bring back the babies she killed. But it does help explain how such tragedies occur. Understanding the factors that lead to neonaticide is essential to preventing future cases. Society must ensure that women facing crisis pregnancies know they have options. Safe haven laws need to be widely publicized. Adoption services must be accessible. Communities need to create environments where young people can seek help without fear of being destroyed by judgment. And families need to communicate that love is more powerful than disappointment, that mistakes can be survived, and that no situation is so terrible that killing a baby is the answer. Lindsay Lowe sits in prison today, serving 2 life sentences for 2 murders that took place minutes after 2 births. Those babies deserve to live. They deserve the chance to take more than a few breaths, to be more than a hidden secret, to exist as children rather than problems. Their deaths were preventable, senseless, and tragic. And Lindsay Lowe will spend the rest of her life paying for the choices she made in that bathroom when fear overrode every other consideration and 2 newborn boys lost their lives before they ever had a chance to live them. These 10 mothers destroyed their own children through violence that ranged from calculated drownings to brutal beatings, from systematic smothering to religious frenzy. Some acted from romantic desperation, others from profound mental illness, still others from shame or a twisted need for attention. Yet what unites every case is a fundamental failure: the failure of the mother to protect, the failure of communities to intervene, the failure of mental health systems to treat, and often the failure of society to support women drowning in postpartum depression, domestic abuse, or isolation. While nothing can excuse the taking of innocent lives, understanding how these tragedies occur is the only path toward preventing future deaths. These children deserved better than the mothers who killed them. But those mothers also deserved better than the systems that failed them. Which of these cases shocked you most, and what do you think could have prevented these tragedies? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this documentary informative, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into true crime's most disturbing cases.